Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the smoke-filled, copper-stained chaos of an 18th century coffee house. And trust me, it's nothing like your local Starbucks. You're about to discover a world where the floor is sticky with spilled beverages and tobacco spit, where chamber pots lurk in dark corners, and where a single penny buys you entry into the most vibrant, argumentative, and frankly unsanitary gathering place in history. You probably won't survive the smell alone, but hey, at least the conversation will distract you from the questionable hygiene. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And down in the comments, drop your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing where in the world you're drifting off tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a narrow London street in 1742, rain misting your wool coat, and before you looms a darkened doorway beneath a creaking wooden sign painted with a coffee pot. The smell hits you first roasted beans, yes, but also tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely resembling old food. Through the warped glass windows, you catch glimpses of candlelight and moving shadows, hear the rumble of male voices arguing about something that sounds important and ridiculous in equal measure. You hesitate. Your hand hovers over the door latch, which is worn smooth by thousands of palms before yours. This is it. Your first visit to a coffee house, that peculiar institution that's been causing social panic and intellectual revolution for the past 80 years. Your wife thinks you're wasting money. Your father thinks coffee houses breed sedition. Your local priest mumbled something about dens of idleness. But everyone who matters, merchants, writers, scientists, politicians, they're all inside. The door resists when you push, swollen from moisture, then suddenly gives way. You stumble slightly into a wall of heat and noise that's almost physical. The transition from the quiet, rain-soaked street to this cacophony is jarring enough to make you pause in the doorway like an idiot while men shoulder past you, muttering about newcomers blocking the entrance. Your eyes struggle to adjust to the dim interior. Candles flicker in sconces along stained walls, their light barely penetrating the thick fog of pipe smoke that hangs like a cloud at head height. The ceiling is lower than you expected, darkened with decades of tobacco residue and soot, and you instinctively duck slightly, even though you're not particularly tall. The floor beneath your boots feels tacky, whether from spilled coffee, spilled ale, or substances you'd rather not contemplate. The room extends further back than it appeared from outside, a warren of wooden booths and benches crammed with bodies. Every seat seems occupied, men packed shoulder to shoulder on benches that were probably designed for half the current occupancy. Some perch on stools, others lean against walls, and a few bold souls have apparently claimed prime spots near the fireplace that glows red in the far corner. Coffee or tea? A boy who can't be older than 12 appears at your elbow, his apron grey with what you hope is just coffee stains. He's carrying a tray laden with mismatched cups, pewter, ceramic, whatever's at hand, and he's navigating the crowd with the casual expertise of someone who's been doing this since he could walk. Coffee, you manage, because that's what people come here for, isn't it? The boy nods, unimpressed by your hesitation, and disappears into the throng. You're left standing awkwardly near the entrance, still clutching your hat, wondering where exactly you're supposed to sit when every surface appears planed. First time, eh? A man with impressive grey side whiskers grins at you from a nearby bench, his teeth stained dark from years of coffee and tobacco. Squeeze in anywhere, lad. No assigned seats in a coffee house. He shifts slightly, creating a gap of perhaps 6 inches between himself and his neighbour. It's barely enough room for a child, let alone a full-grown adult, but you realise this is as good an invitation as you're likely to receive. You wedge yourself onto the bench, your thighs pressed uncomfortably against strangers on either side. Nobody seems to find this unusual. The man to your left is reading a newspaper on of those cheap, scandal-filled rags that your wife insists are beneath proper people, and he's muttering darkly about something involving the Prime Minister and misappropriated funds. The man to your right is locked in heated debate with someone across the table about navigation techniques, complete with wild hand gestures that nearly knock over several coffee cups. Historians still argue whether coffee houses truly democratized 18th century society or merely created the illusion of equality while maintaining existing hierarchies. But sitting here, crushed between a merchant and what appears to be a minor gentleman, those academic distinctions feel distant. What's immediate is the smell of the man beside you. Not good, the heat of too many bodies in too small a space, and the overwhelming sense that you've stumbled into something significant. The coffee boy reappears with remarkable speed and thrusts a cup into your hands. It's hot enough to burn your fingers through the ceramic. You fumble for a penny the standard price and drop it into his perpetually outstretched palm. He's gone before you can even nod your thanks, already serving the next customer, the next impatient hand waving for service. You look down at your first legitimate cup of Coffeehouse coffee. The liquid is almost black, with an oily sheen on its surface and what appears to be grounds floating near the rim. It smells bitter and burnt, nothing like the carefully prepared brew you've occasionally sampled in private homes. This is the fuel of empire, the lubricant of commerce, the beverage that's supposedly making Englishmen more alert and productive than their ale-sodden ancestors. You take a sip. It tastes like someone burned dirt, mixed it with water, and decided to charge money for the privilege of drinking it. Your face must betray your reaction because the grey-whiskered man chuckles. "It's an acquired taste," he says, not unkindly. "Give it 3 visits. By then you'll be craving it." Around you, the coffeehouse roars on arguments about politics, whispered business deals, bursts of laughter, the rustle of newspapers and pamphlets being passed hand to hand. You've crossed the threshold. There's no going back now. Now that your eyes have adjusted and you've choked down that first bitter sip, you can actually take stock of your surroundings. And honestly, cramped doesn't begin to cover it. The coffeehouse you've entered occupies what was probably once a modest shop or tavern, retrofitted for its new purpose with all the architectural finesse of someone shoving furniture into a closet and calling it a drawing room. The ceiling can't be more than 7 feet high, which means the taller patrons among you are permanently hunched, their necks bent at angles that will definitely cause problems in old age. Dark wooden beams cross overhead, their surfaces blackened by decades of smoke until they look like they might have survived a fire, though really they're just marinating in tobacco residue and soot from inadequate ventilation. Between the beams, the plaster is cracked and water-stained, with suspicious brown patches that suggest the rooms above aren't exactly watertight. Your bench is one of a dozen squeezed into the main room, each one a scarred piece of oak worn smooth by countless backsides. They're arranged in rough rows facing each other across narrow table sand. When I say narrow, I mean you could reach across and grab the newspaper from the man opposite without even extending your arm fully. The tables themselves are a patchwork of damage, burn marks from carelessly placed pipes, deep gouges that might be initials or might just be violence, rings upon rings from wet cups that nobody bothered to wipe up. The booths along the walls are even more intimate, if you can call being pressed against strangers intimate. They're essentially boxes with high wooden backs designed to create the illusion of privacy while offering absolutely none. You can hear every word from the booth behind you, something about a shipment of tobacco from Virginia and whether the merchant in question can be trusted not to water down the product. The partitions don't even reach the ceiling, so conversations drift and mingle in the smoky air above, creating a constant babble that's somehow both chaotic and oddly comforting. Look down at the floor and you'll regret it. The wooden planks are so stained and sticky that you can actually hear your boots peeling away from the surface when you shift your weight. Spilled coffee has created dark continents across the boards, mixed with tobacco juice, God knows what else, and the accumulated traffic of muddy boots dragging in half the street outside. There's sawdust scattered around in a half-hearted attempt at absorption, but it just creates a sort of grimy paste that sticks to everything. The walls are panelled in dark wood, or at least they were once. Now they're mostly obscured by notices, advertisements, and handbills tacked up in layers like some kind of papier-mâché project. Lost, "1 spaniel," answers to Charles, announces one. "Shipping news latest arrivals," proclaims another. There's an advertisement for a new play, something about wig powder, a reward notice for a runaway apprentice. Reading the walls could occupy you for hours, except the light is too dim and you'd have to actually stand up and push through the crowd to get close enough. Speaking of light, there isn't much of it. The windows facing the street are small and grimy, their glass thick and warped, letting in only a murky approximation of daylight. By evening, which is rapidly approaching, you're entirely dependent on candles and the fireplace. Sconces dot the walls at irregular intervals, each holding a tallow candle that sputters and smokes, adding to the general haze. The better coffee houses use beeswax, you've heard, but apparently this establishment hasn't reached such lofty heights. The fireplace dominates one wall, a massive stone structure that's probably the only original feature in the room. It's surrounded by the most coveted seats in the house clothes, enough to stay warm, not so close. You risk setting yourself on fire. An actual hierarchy exists around that fireplace, you realize. The men nearest it are better dressed, more confident, clearly regulars who've earned their proximity to heat through years of patronage. Historians still argue whether the physical layout of coffee houses, with their forced proximity and lack of private space, intentionally promoted the mixing of social classes, or whether it was simply a pragmatic response to expensive urban real estate, that either way, you're currently sharing a bench with people you'd never encounter in normal society. The cramped conditions are the point, in a way. Can't maintain aristocratic distance when someone's elbow is literally in your ribs. Above your head, you can hear footsteps and muffled voices. There are rooms upstairs, private meeting spaces that can be rented by the hour for business discussions, political meetings, or literary societies. The Society of Dilettanti meets above a coffee house. So does the Royal Society, occasionally. Some of the greatest minds in England are probably pacing around directly over your head right now, arguing about science or philosophy, while you're down here trying not to get coffee grounds in your teeth. The actual coffee-making apparatus is visible near the back walla, large copper pot suspended over a small fire, tended by a man who looks like he hasn't slept in 3 days. He's scooping roasted beans from a sack, grinding them in a hand mill that screeches like a dying cat, dumping the grounds into the pot and ladling out cups with mechanical efficiency. No filtering, no measuring, no ceremony. Just coffee, as basic and brutal as the room that serves it. There's a corner devoted to what you assume is the primitive sanitation facilities, a half-curtained alcove that you're going to avoid as long as humanly possible. The smell wafting from that direction suggests that facilities is a generous term. Chamber pots, basically, emptied with whatever frequency the establishment deems sufficient, which is clearly not frequent enough. Your grey-whiskered neighbour has noticed your wandering gaze. "Not what you expected, eh?" he asks, tamping fresh tobacco into his clay pipe. "Wait till summer. When it's hot, the smell really comes into its own." He says this with obvious affection, the way someone might describe a beloved but flatulent dog. You're wedged into a space that violates every principle of comfort and personal space you've ever held dear. Your coat is getting soaked with second-hand smoke. Your boots are probably ruined. And somehow, impossibly, you're already starting to feel at home. Let's talk about what you're breathing, because calling it air feels generous. The atmosphere inside this coffee house is less oxygen and more a visible, tangible substance composed of layers upon layers of competing smells, each one fighting for dominance in your nasal passages. If you could see smell the way you see smoke, the room would be opaque. The coffee itself, that's the baseline, the foundation note in this olfactory symphony from hell. It's a dark, roasted scent, bitter and slightly burnt, like someone took perfectly good beans and decided to punish them. But it's not unpleasant exactly. There's something earthy and honest about it, a smell that says, "I'm here to wake you up, not coddle you." The aroma drifts from that copper pot in the back, mixing with the steam that rises from dozens of cups, creating a warm, almost comforting fog of caffeinated promise. Then there's the tobacco. Oh, the tobacco. Every man in here, and it is exclusively men at this hour, seems to be nursing a clay pipe, creating a cloud so thick you could practically chew it. The smoke hangs in horizontal layers, barely moving in the still air, adding a sweet, acrid edge to every breath you take. It's not like modern cigarette smoke. This is rougher, earthier, the cheap stuff that dock workers and merchants can afford in bulk. It stings your eyes and coats your throat, and you know without question that your clothes will smell like this for days. Your wife is going to have opinions. Beneath those dominant scents lurks something more problematic: human bodies, packed too close together, many of whom haven't seen a proper bath in weeks. Personal hygiene in the 1740s is not what you call rigorous. The man to your left radiates a smell that's part sweat, part wool that's been worn too long, part something indefinably organic that you're trying not to analyze. Multiply that by 40 or 50 bodies in an enclosed space with minimal ventilation. Add the heat from the fireplace and all those living, breathing, perspiring humans, and you've got what can only be described as ripe. The thing is, nobody else seems bothered by this. The men around you are completely unbothered, chatting and arguing and drinking their coffee as if they're not marinating in a stew of their own collective funk. And that's because this is normal. This is just what gatherings of people smell like in 1742. Deodorant won't be invented for another century and a half. Regular bathing is actually considered medically suspicious by some physicians who worry that water opens the pores to disease. You're living in humanity's natural state, my friend, and natural humanity is pungent. From that curtain corner you've been studiously ignoring comes the unmistakable smell of the chamber pots. It's urine mostly, with occasional worse additions, sitting in ceramic vessels that are emptied at the proprietor's convenience. The curtain does exactly nothing to contain the smell, which wafts through the room in waves, especially when someone brushes past the fabric on their way to add their contribution. You're learning to breathe through your mouth, which helps slightly, though then you can taste it instead. But wait, there's more. The floor contributes its own special bouquet decades of spilled beverages, tracked in mud, tobacco spit, and the aforementioned sawdust paste, creating a bass note that's almost agricultural. It smells like a barn floor, if the barn also served coffee and hosted political debates. Food smells drift in from somewhere, maybe a kitchen, maybe just vendors outside selling pies or roasted chestnuts. There's a meaty, savoury element cutting through the coffee and tobacco, probably mutton or beef, rendered fat and charred bits. Some coffeehouses serve food, though this one seems to focus primarily on beverages and tolerating the presence of its patrons. Historians still argue whether the distinctive smell of coffeehouses contributed to their appeal or worked against them in polite society, but you're starting to understand why some women petitioned against these establishments. It's not just the all-male atmosphere, it's that their husbands come home reeking like they've been rolling around in a tobacco barn while someone nearby relieved themselves. There's also leather, the smell of dozens of boots, belts, satchels, and the occasional leather-bound book. It's a rich, tanned scent that somehow manages to cut through the other smells occasionally, particularly when someone shifts position and their coat releases a puff of leather-scented air. Mixed with that is ink from newspapers, pamphlets, and the occasional letter being written at the tables. It's a metallic, slightly chemical smell that speaks of information flowing, ideas being printed and distributed. Your grey-whiskered companion has just released a particularly fragrant cloud of tobacco smoke directly into your face. Virginian, he announces proudly, as if you asked. Best quality. None of that reconstituted rubbish the cheap houses serve. The smoke smells exactly like the smoke everyone else is producing, but you nod politely because apparently there's a whole hierarchy of tobacco quality you're not privy to. Someone near the fireplace has ordered chocolate instead of coffee, and a new smell enters the mix sweet, rich, slightly spicy. It's exotic and expensive. A smell that doesn't quite belong in this working establishment, and heads actually turn to identify the wealthy patron who can afford such luxuries. The chocolate smell is almost offensive in its pleasantness, making everything else seem worse by comparison. The door opens, admitting a gust of rain-freshened air from outside, and for exactly 3 seconds you remember what clean air smells like. Then the door shuts, the newcomer settles in, and the usual miasma reasserts itself. Here's something they don't tell you in the romantic histories of coffeehouse culture. You can actually feel the air coating your lungs. Each breath is textured, full of particulates, tobacco smoke, coffee steam, general mustiness. You're not just smelling the coffeehouse, you're absorbing it, incorporating it into your very tissue. By the time you leave, you won't just smell like this place, you'll carry it inside you. And yet, there's something almost intoxicating about it all, this concentration of humanity and its activities. The smell of the coffeehouse is the smell of life being lived at full volume, commerce, debate, pleasure, basic bodily functions, all of it happening simultaneously in one cramped aromatic space. You take another sip of your terrible coffee, breathing through your mouth to avoid the worst of it, and realize you're already adjusting. The smell that seemed overwhelming 5 minutes ago is fading into background noise. Give it another hour and you won't notice it at all. That's probably not a good sign for your nose's judgment, but here we are. Right, let's address the elephant in the room, rather the murky brown liquid in your cup. You're holding what is technically coffee, in the sense that it was once coffee beans and is now a drinkable liquid, but the journey between those two states has been neither gentle nor particularly hygienic. Take another sip. Go on, I'll wait. Notice how it's simultaneously too hot and somehow already lukewarm? That's because the top layer, exposed to air, has cooled while the depths remain scalding enough to blister your tongue. There's no middle ground, no pleasant drinking temperature, just thermal chaos in a cup. You try to blow on it, which achieves nothing except making the grounds floating on top swirl around like a tiny, bitter whirlpool. The taste. Oh, the taste. Imagine taking charcoal, grinding it to powder, mixing it with hot water, and adding a hint of, is that soil? Actual dirt? The bitterness hits first, coating your tongue and the inside of your cheeks with an astringent film that makes you want to immediately drink anything else. But you're in a coffeehouse, so your only option is more coffee. It's a vicious cycle, really. There's no sweetness, no smooth finish, none of the complexity that modern coffee snobs drone on about. This is coffee stripped down to its most brutal, fundamental elements. Caffeine delivery system, end of story. The beans were probably over-roasted to begin withiasia to mask inferior quality that way thin ground too coarsely, then boiled rather than brewed, which extracts all the worst compounds while leaving behind anything pleasant. And the texture, sweet mercy, the texture. You're not so much drinking this coffee as chewing it. Grounds have settled at the bottom of your cup, sure, but plenty more are suspended throughout the liquid, creating a grainy, gritty experience with every swallow. Little bits stick between your teeth. You can feel them coating your tongue. By the time you finish this cup, you have consumed what amounts to a spoonful of coffee sludge along with the liquid. The man across from you drains his cup in 3 large gulps, grounds and all, then immediately signals for another. He doesn't even flinch. How? How is he not gagging? But you look around and everyone else is doing the same, downing this vile brew, like it's water, like it's pleasant, like their taste buds haven't staged a full revolt. Here's what's happening back at that copper pot. The coffee boy's father or uncle or whoever runs this establishment is taking beans that were roasted anywhere from 3 days to 3 months, there's no real consistency, and grinding them in batches as needed. The grounds go straight into boiling water, no filter, no careful temperature control, just grounds plus heat equals coffee. It boils away for a while, getting more bitter and more concentrated until someone ladles it into your cup, grounds and all. No paper filters exist yet, no French press, no espresso machine. Certainly no pour-over technique with carefully calibrated water temperature and bloom time. This is medieval coffee-making technology being applied to a substance that deserves so much better. The beans themselves have had quite a journey to reach your cup, and not a pleasant one. They started life in Yemen or Java or the Caribbean. Coffee is the hot colonial commodity right now, with European powers fighting over who gets to grow it where. The beans were picked, dried, shipped across oceans in the holds of ships where they absorbed moisture and probably rat droppings, then sold to a London merchant, then resold to your coffeehouse proprietor who bought whatever was cheapest that week. Quality control is not a priority. Some beans are moldy, some are broken, some are still partially raw while others are burnt. They all go in the grinder together, creating a frankly terrifying mixture that produces coffee of wildly varying strength and flavor. Today's cut might be weak and watery. Tomorrow's might strip the enamel off your teeth. There's no consistency, no standards, no regulation requiring anyone to serve drinkable coffee. Historians still argue whether the English preference for tea over coffee in later decades stemmed from genuine taste preferences or from the consistently terrible quality of Coffeehouse. Coffee-making tea seemed delightful by comparison, but sitting here with grounds between your molars, you're starting to lean toward the quality control theory. You notice that some patrons are adding things to their coffee. The wealthier gentleman near the fireplace has procured sugar expensive, but it helps mask the bitterness. Others are adding milk, which at least gives the illusion of smoothness, even if it doesn't do much for the grounds situation. A few brave souls are drinking it black, seemingly on principle, like suffering is part of the coffeehouse experience. The temperature has now shifted from molten lava to tepid pond water in the space of about 90 seconds. There's no insulation, no thermal mass to maintain heat. Your cup is ceramic, thin-walled, and the cold air of the room is rapidly winning the battle against your coffee's warmth. If you don't drink it soon, you'll be choking down cold, grainy coffee, which somehow sounds even worse than hot, grainy coffee. Here's a fun fact. Coffee reached England in the 1650s, which means you're drinking a beverage that's been available for less than a century. It's still exotic, still foreign, still carrying the whiff of the Ottoman Empire and far-off lands. Some people still think it has medicinal properties, good for digestion, mental clarity, preventing drowsiness. Others think it's dangerous, that it dries out the body's natural humors, that it makes men effeminate and argumentative. Your wife is in the latter camp, by the way. She's heard that coffee makes husbands spend all their time in coffee houses instead of at home, renders them incapable of performing their marital duties, and turns them into seditious radicals who question the natural order of society. She's not entirely wrong on the first and third counts, but here's the thing that's starting to dawn on you as you force down another gritty mouthful. It's working. The caffeine is hitting your system. Your thoughts are sharpening. The fog of the rainy afternoon is lifting. You feel more alert, more present, more ready to engage with the chaos around you. This terrible, awful, grainy mudwater is actually doing something. The men around you aren't drinking this stuff because it tastes good. They're drinking it because it wakes them up, because it keeps them sharp during long business negotiations, because unlike ale or wine, it doesn't dull their wits. Coffee is liquid productivity, and in an era of expanding commerce and complex financial instruments, staying sharp is worth choking down some grounds. You drain your cup well, most of it. The bottom third is basically solid grounds, and even you have limits. Your grey-whiskered neighbour nods approvingly. Not bad for your first, he says. Most newcomers gag on their second sip. You'll be a regular in no time. The scary part is you think he might be right. Now that you've survived your first cup and your eyes have stopped watering from the tobacco smoke, you can actually focus on the human zoo surrounding you. And what a collection of specimens they are. If you were to design a social experiment bringing together people who would normally never share the same space, you'd struggle to create a more chaotic mix than what's currently crammed onto these benches. To your immediate right sits a merchant. You can tell by his practical wool coat, the ink stains on his fingers, and the ledger he's consulting while simultaneously arguing about tariff rates with someone across the table. He's middle-aged, prosperous enough to afford decent clothing, but not so wealthy that he's above sitting in a public coffee house. His wig is slightly askew, probably from running his hands through it during heated negotiations, and he's keeping one protective hand on a leather satchel that presumably contains either money or important documents. Possibly both. 3 seats down, there's a young man in clothes that were fashionable about 5 years ago, fraying cuffs, coat that's been let out and taken in multiple times, shoes that have seen better decades. But he's gesticulating wildly while reciting what sounds like poetry to a small captive audience who can't escape because they're wedged into the same booth. A writer, probably, or an aspiring writer. The coffee houses are full of them, nursing single cups for hours while they work on their manuscripts or argue about meter and metaphor. Near the fireplace, of course, near the fireplace sits a gentleman who is so obviously aristocratic that he might as well be wearing a sign. His coat is velvet, his wig is perfectly powdered, and he's holding his coffee cup with the kind of delicate grip that suggests he's not entirely sure what he's doing in this establishment, but is determined to appear worldly. He's probably slumming it, seeking the authentic coffeehouse experience before returning to his much more comfortable club in St. Teal, James's. 2 younger men hover near him, laughing at his jokes with the desperate enthusiasm of Hangerson hoping for patronage. But here's where it gets interesting. Wedged between the merchant and a group of ship's captains discussing Caribbean trade routes, there's a man whose profession you can't immediately identify. He's watching everyone with sharp, calculating eyes, his fingers constantly moving, counting, tapping, assessing. His clothes are nondescript but clean. He orders coffee but barely drinks it. And when the merchant next to you briefly sets his satchel on the floor to reach for his pipe, this man's eyes track its movement with predatory precision. Yeah, that's probably a pickpocket. Or a confidence man. Or some other variety of criminal finding the coffee house, an excellent hunting ground for distracted marks with money. The captains are easy to spot weather-beaten faces, loud voices accustomed to shouting over wind and waves, hands that gesture broadly when describing storms or foreign ports. They're comparing notes on the fastest route to Virginia, arguing about which harbors have the most corrupt customs officials, sharing intelligence about which colonial governors can be bribed and which are annoyingly honest. This is valuable information they're trading, the kind that can save weeks of sailing time or avoid costly confiscations, and they're sharing it openly in a public coffee house because this is where such things are done. There's a clergyman in the corner. His collar gives him away, reading a newspaper with an expression of profound disapproval. You're not sure if he disapproves of the news or the coffeehouse itself, or possibly both. The church has complicated feelings about these establishments. On one hand, they're better than alehouses because at least coffee doesn't cause drunkenness. On the other hand, they're breeding grounds for radical ideas and seditious talk. This particular clergyman seems to have decided that monitoring the situation from within is preferable to ignorance, which is very pragmatic of him. Historians still argue whether coffee houses genuinely erased class distinctions or merely created a theatrical space where such erasure could be performed without actually threatening social hierarchies. But right now, you're watching a dupe's nephew share a bench with a printer's apprentice, and both seem equally focused on the newspaper between them. The apprentices and clerks are everywhere, young men in their late teens and 20s who've escaped their masters for an hour or two. They cluster together, voices high with excitement, drinking coffee because it makes them feel adult and sophisticated. Some are genuinely here for the conversation and newspapers. Others are clearly just avoiding work. Your grey-whiskered neighbour occasionally glares at them when their laughter gets too loud, muttering about young people these days, with the eternal complaint of the middle-aged. There's a lawyer in here somewhere, you can tell by the way he's drafting something on a portable writing desk balanced on his knees, occasionally consulting with a nervous-looking client who keeps glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. The coffee house serves as office space for professions that don't require formal premises. Why pay rent for chambers when you can conduct business here for the price of a few cups of coffee? A group of medical students or young physicians are debating the merits of bloodletting versus purging for treating fever, their voices carrying over the general din with confident ignorance. Neither treatment will actually help, but they don't know that yet, and they're arguing their positions with passionate conviction. One of them is illustrating his point by drawing diagrams in spilled coffee on the table, which is probably the most useful thing that coffee has been used for all day. In the booth behind you, you can hear two men conducting what sounds suspiciously like a business deal involving smuggled French brandy. They're not even being particularly quiet about it. Coffee houses exist in this weird legal grey area where authorities know illegal business is being conducted, but don't quite know what to do about it. Raid every coffee house and you'd have a riot. Ignore them entirely and you are tacitly approving smuggling. So there's this understanding that certain conversations just aren't heard, officially speaking. There's even a couple of foreigners. You can tell by their accents and slightly different style of dress speaking, a mixture of English and what might be French or Dutch. London's coffee houses attract merchants and travellers from across Europe and beyond. You might share a bench with someone from Amsterdam, Constantinople or Boston, all gathered in this smoky room to conduct business and exchange information. And threading through all of this chaos are the coffee boys, moving with practiced efficiency, somehow remembering who ordered what, collecting coins, dodging elbows, and never spilling a drop despite the impossible crowding. They're the invisible infrastructure holding this whole operation together, and absolutely nobody acknowledges their skill. The man you suspect is a pickpocket has just struck up a conversation with an elderly gentleman who looks half asleep. You briefly consider warning him, but honestly, anyone foolish enough to fall asleep in a coffee house full of strangers probably deserves whatever happens to their pocket watch. This is your community now. Criminals and clergymen, poets and pickpockets, merchants and morons, all crammed together in pursuit of coffee, conversation, and the peculiar democracy of shared bench space. Here's the thing that's really starting to dawn on you as you watch this motley crowd. In any other context, half these people wouldn't acknowledge the other half's existence. The gentleman by the fireplace and the dock worker currently arguing with him about shipping schedules would normally occupy completely different worlds. They'd pass each other on the street without making eye contact, maintained in their separate spheres by the invisible but ironclad rules of 18th century social hierarchy. But here they're sitting 2 feet apart, both nursing coffee, both equally entitled to join the conversation, both theoretically equals. It's bizarre. It's unprecedented. And it's absolutely not supposed to work according to every social rule you've been taught since childhood. Watch the gentleman in the velvet coat try to navigate this. He's used to deference, to people stepping aside, to conversations stopping when he approaches. But the merchant next to him just interrupted his story about hunting in Scotland to correct him on the price of tobacco. Just flatly contradicted him, and the gentleman, he looks startled, offended. But he can't quite figure out how to respond because the unwritten rule of the coffee house is that everyone's voice carries equal weight. That rule, by the way, is more aspiration than reality, but the aspiration itself is revolutionary. The idea that a penny admission buys you the right to participate in conversation regardless of your birth or breeding. That's not how English society works. Except here, apparently, it does. Your grey-whiskered companion leans over, following your gaze. See that fellow there? He gestures subtly toward a well-dressed man deep in conversation with someone whose hands are literally still dirty from manual labour. That's Viscount something or other. Can't remember which. Doesn't matter in here. Last week I watched him argue with a carpenter for 2 hours about the true nature of gravity. The carpenter won. The coffee house operates on a fictiona, beautiful, radical fiction that talent and intelligence matter more than birth. That a clever apprentice's observation about politics is worth as much as a baron's. That knowledge trumps nobility. Of course, the baron still goes home to his estate and the apprentice to his cramped attic room. But for these few hours in this smoke-filled space, the pretense is maintained with surprising seriousness. Look at the seating arrangements. Nobody has reserved spots based on rank. It's first come, first served, which means you might find yourself wedged between a wine merchant and a minor poet, with a sea captain's elbow in your back and a law clerk's feet tangling with yours under the table. Physical proximity that would be scandalous anywhere else is simply practical necessity here. The newspapers circulating through the room don't discriminate either. The same copy passes from well-manicured hands to calloused ones, read with equal interest by those who can barely afford the paper and those who could buy the entire print run. Information flows democratically, or as democratically as information can flow in a society where literacy itself is a marker of privilege. But let's not get too romantic about this whole equality thing. There are subtle hierarchies even here, invisible lines of status that everyone understands, even if nobody explicitly acknowledges them. The seats nearest the fireplace go to regulars, and regulars tend to be those with money and time, and not the apprentices sneaking away from work. The best tables are claimed early by those whose schedules allow for leisure. The proprietor definitely gives faster service to customers who tip well or order expensive chocolate instead of just nursing a single coffee for 3 hours. Historians still argue whether coffeehouses truly democratized discourse or simply created a safe space for elite men to play act at equality while maintaining their actual privileges, and honestly, you can see evidence for both interpretations right here in this room. The Duke's nephew is definitely enjoying slumming it with the common folk, but he'll go home to comfort and luxury while the printer's apprentice beside him returns to a 14-hour workday. Still, something real is happening here. Ideas are mixing in ways they wouldn't anywhere else. The merchant is explaining compound interest to a group that includes both a gentleman and a labourer, and both are listening with equal attention because money doesn't care about your social class, only about whether you understand how it works. The medical students are being challenged on their theories by a barber surgeon who's actually seen the insides of human bodies, and they're listening because practical experience sometimes trumps theoretical education. There's a conversation happening near you about the new road being built north of the city. Contributing to this discussion, a gentleman investor, a surveyor who's actually measuring the route, a labourer who'll do the digging, and a merchant who plans to use the road for transport. Each brings different knowledge, different perspectives, and somehow they're synthesizing this into a richer understanding than any one of them could achieve alone. This is the penny university. Everyone keeps talking about the idea that for 1 penny, the price of admission, you gain access to education through conversation. No formal curriculum, no professors, just the accumulated knowledge of whoever happens to be in the room. Want to learn about navigation? Sit near the sea captains. Interested in law? Eavesdrop on the attorneys. Curious about science? The natural philosophers are debating in the corner. Of course, the quality of this education varies wildly. For every genuine expert sharing valuable knowledge, there's a blowhard confidently spouting nonsense. You're currently listening to a man explain economics who clearly doesn't understand basic arithmetic, but he's speaking with such authority that several people are taking notes. The women's absence is glaring once you notice it. This democratic experiment in social mixing apparently has hard limits, and one of them is gender. There are no female voices in this room, no women's perspectives in these debates, no mothers or wives or daughters participating in the penny university. Some coffee houses allow women, mostly prostitutes, or women of questionable reputation, but respectable women. They're excluded from this particular revolution, which means this isn't really democracy. It's a very specific kind of limited equality among men of certain types. Progressive for 1742, sure, but let's not pretend it's actually egalitarian. A commotion erupts near the door. 2 men are arguing about something, philosophy maybe, or politics, and their voices are rising to the point where the proprietor is moving in to calm things down. Here's another unwritten rule. Argument is encouraged, but physical altercation gets you thrown out regardless of your social standing. The gentleman and the labourer both get the boot if they start throwing punches. That, at least, is genuinely equal. The argument subsides. The proprietor returns to his copper pot. The normal chaos of conversation resumes. And you're sitting here, wedged between strangers from completely different worlds, all of you drinking terrible coffee and pretending that this is normal. The really crazy thing? It's starting to feel normal. You're about to witness something that will shape global capitalism for the next 3 centuries, and it's happening right now at the table, 2 booths over. Pay attention, because this is how empires get financed. 3 men are huddled over what looks like a ship's manifest, their voices low but intense. One is clearly a merchant. You recognize the type by now, and he's explaining to the other 2 that he's got a vessel leaving for the Caribbean in 3 weeks, fully loaded with manufactured goods to trade for sugar. The problem? He needs capital to purchase the cargo, and he won't see returns for at least 6 months, possibly longer if the winds are unfavorable or the ship has to wait in port. The other 2 men are listening with the focused attention of people evaluating risk versus reward. One pulls out a small notebook and starts doing calculations, his lips moving as he works through interest rates and profit margins. The other asks pointed questions. What's the captain's reputation? Which ports? What's the backup plan if Spanish privateers intercept the vessel? You're watching the birth of a business partnership right here over coffee that's going cold while they negotiate. By the time they finish this conversation, they'll have structured an investment that spreads risk among multiple parties, provides the merchant with necessary capital, and offers the investors a share of profits if, and it's a big if everything goes according to plan. This is what coffeehouses do better than anywhere else in London. They facilitate deals. The proximity, the neutral territory, the constant flow of information, it all creates an environment where commerce moves at the speed of conversation. No need to arrange formal meetings at someone's home or office. Just show up at the right coffee house at the right time and you'll find the people you need. Different coffee houses specialize in different trades. You're learning. This particular establishment seems to attract shipping merchants and their investors, which makes sense given its proximity to the Thames. But there's a place called Lloyd's, about half a mile from here, where ship captains and merchants gather specifically to arrange insurance. The whole modern insurance industry is literally being invented in a coffee house, by men drinking coffee and trying to figure out how to not lose everything when ships sink. Here's how it works at Lloyd's. Ship owners come in and describe their vessels and planned voyages. Investors, underwriters, they're starting to call assess the risk and agree to cover a portion of potential losses in exchange for a premium. If the ship makes it home safely, the underwriter keeps the premium as profit. If it sinks, the underwriter pays out their agreed portion of the loss. Multiple underwriters might split the risk on a single voyage, each one literally writing their name under the terms of the agreement. Underwriters. The etymology is almost too perfect. Historians still argue whether these informal coffeehouse arrangements actually reduced risk or simply spread it around more efficiently without changing the fundamental dangers of maritime trade. But regardless, the system is catching on fast. It's better than the alternative, which was basically praying your ship didn't sink and going bankrupt if it did. Your merchant neighbour has just concluded his own negotiation. Not a major shipping venture, but something involving a warehouse lease and shared storage costs. They're shaking hands over it. No written contract, just an agreement between men whose reputations are vouched for by mutual acquaintances in the coffeehouse. This is how business worked before lawyers formalized everything, and honestly, it's both terrifying and admirably efficient. There's a particular corner of the room where the stock jobbers congregate. These are the men who buy and sell shares in the various trading companies, the East India Company, the South Sea Company, smaller ventures. They're trading paper, essentially, little certificates that represent ownership stakes in commercial enterprises. The prices fluctuate based on news, rumors, and sheer speculation, and these men are making fortunes or losing everything based on their ability to read the market. One of them is currently trying to unload shares in some mining operation, speaking in urgent whispers to anyone who'll listen. The desperation in his voice suggests the shares are probably worthless, but he's hoping to find someone who hasn't heard whatever bad news has just reached London. It's insider trading, sort of, except there are no securities regulations yet, so it's just trading. Perfectly legal, morally questionable, and happening openly in public. The financial instruments being created and traded in these rooms are increasingly complex. Futures contracts, options, joint stock arrangements that distribute both risk and reward the coffee houses are laboratories for financial innovation, with real money on the line and no regulatory oversight to slow things down. It's the Wild West of capitalism. If the Wild West were smoky, cramped, and smelled like unwashed merchants, you overhear a fascinating conversation about something called bubbles. Not the soap kind, but financial bubbles where speculation drives prices far above rational value until the whole thing collapses. Someone citing the tulip mania in Holland decades ago as a cautionary tale, while another voice insists that's different, that the current enthusiasm for colonial ventures is based on sound fundamentals. You make a mental note to avoid whatever scheme sounds too good to be true, which is probably wise advice for all of human history. There's actual money changing hands around you constantly. Not just pennies for coffee, but serious sums promissory notes, letters of credit, actual gold coins being counted out on tables sticky with spilled beverages. The coffeehouse proprietor doesn't seem bothered by his establishment serving as an informal bank. If anything, it's probably good for business. The more deals being made, the more coffee being consumed to seal them. The lawyers are here too, of course, hovering like sharks around the business negotiations. They're offering to formalize agreements, draft contracts, handle the paperwork that turns handshake deals into legally binding documents. For a fee, naturally, some merchants use them, wanting the security of written terms. Others prefer the old way, trusting reputation and mutual acquaintances over parchment and legalese. A cluster of younger men merchants' sons probably, learning the family business air, watching the senior traders with obvious fascination. This is their education, right here. No university teaches practical commerce like this. You learn by observing, by listening to deals being made, by understanding how experienced traders assess risk and opportunity. Some of them are taking notes, trying to remember the terms being used, the calculations being made. The merchant who was negotiating the warehouse lease stands up to leave, and you notice he's leaving his coffee unfinished. Too busy making money to drink terrible coffee, apparently. His partners remain, immediately pivoting to a new conversation about textile imports from India. The business never stops, the deals keep flowing as long as the coffee holds out. You're starting to understand why these establishments make some people nervous. This isn't just men socializing over coffee. This is the machinery of commerce in action, operating with minimal oversight, creating wealth and loss in equal measure, building the financial systems that will define modern capitalism. And it's all happening in a cramped, smoky room where the floor is sticky and the coffee tastes like punishment. Now that you've absorbed the commercial chaos, let's talk about what's happening at that booth in the far corner where voices are deliberately low and heads are bent close together. That's where the really dangerous activity takes place, not financial speculation, but political speculation. And in 1742, speculating about politics out loud can get you arrested, tried for sedition, and possibly hanged. The government knows exactly what happens in coffee houses. They know that these establishments are breeding grounds for radical ideas, hotbeds of dissent, places where men gather to criticize the crown, mock parliament, and discuss concepts like natural rights and limited monarchy that make officials very nervous. Oh, they know, and they're watching. That well-dressed man sitting alone near the window, the one who seems to be reading a newspaper but whose eyes keep scanning the room. There's a decent chance he's an informer paid by the government to monitor conversations and report back on anything that smells like sedition. The Crown employs networks of these people, infiltrating coffee houses to identify potential troublemakers before they become actual problems. But here's the thing. Everyone knows informers exist and everyone talks anyway. The allure of free speech, even dangerous speech, is too strong to resist. So conversations happen in code or behind hands or with strategic vagueness that allows plausible deniability if questioned later. Hypothetically speaking, men say, before launching into criticisms of the government that are anything but hypothetical. The newspapers being passed around are weapons of political warfare, and the coffeehouse is their armory. You're currently watching a pamphlet circulate through the room. It's that cheap, roughly printed sheet being read with such intense interest. It's probably criticizing some government policy or minister, possibly accusing someone important of corruption, definitely pushing the boundaries of what's legally permissible to print. The thing about newspapers and pamphlets in this era, they're not objective news reporting. They're propaganda, pure and simple, funded by various political factions to advance their agendas. The Whigs have their papers. The Tories have theirs. Various ministers and opposition figures sponsor their own publications, and they all circulate through coffeehouses where readers absorb partisan talking points and then argue about them as if they're established facts. Someone just made a joke about the Prime Minister Robert Walpole, currently running the government with a combination of political genius and shameless corruption. The joke involves his personal life and financial arrangements, and it's both hilarious and probably treasonous. The whole table laughs, including you, because apparently you've already decided that risking your neck for a clever political joke is worth it. Walpole actually tried to shut down coffeehouses back in 1675. Well, not Walpole personally, he wasn't in power yet, but King Charles II issued a proclamation attempting to suppress them entirely, claiming they were centres of seditious activity and spreaders of false news. The proclamation lasted about 11 days before public outcry forced its withdrawal. You can't just eliminate the places where the entire commercial and intellectual class conducts its daily business, turns out. But the government never stopped being suspicious. They still monitor. They still arrest people for seditious speech. They still prosecute publishers of particularly inflammatory pamphlets. The threat is real, which makes the casual nature of political discussion here even more remarkable. Men are risking imprisonment to complain about tax policy. Historians still argue whether coffeehouses genuinely fostered political revolution or simply provided a pressure release valve that allowed dissent without actually threatening the existing order. But sitting here listening to someone advocate for limiting the monarchy's power, you're pretty sure the authorities would vote for genuinely threatening. There's a group near you discussing the Jacobite caused the movement to restore the Stuart dynasty to the throne. This is extremely dangerous territory. Supporting the Jacobites is literal treason, and people are executed for it. Yet here are several men, voices lowered but not silent, talking about whether Charles Edward Stuart has legitimate claims to the crown. They're probably just engaging in intellectual debate, playing devil's advocate, but if the wrong person overhears and reports them, intellectual debate becomes a capital offence. The lawyer you noticed earlier is now explaining to a worried-looking client the precise legal definition of seditious libel. Apparently, the client either wrote or published something that caught official attention, and now he's trying to determine whether he's merely risked a fine or actually risked his neck. The lawyer's advice seems to be apologize profusely, claim misunderstanding, blame the printer, and hope the authorities have bigger fish to fry. A fresh pamphlet arrives, delivered by a boy who's clearly making the rounds of multiple coffeehouses. This one's still wet from the press, and there's immediate scramble for first viewing rights. You catch a glimpse of the title, something about the true character of certain ministers, which is code for we're about to absolutely destroy someone's reputation with barely concealed accusations. The first reader is already laughing, then reading choice passages aloud to the table. It's savage political satire, the kind that uses allegory so thin you can see right through it. A certain noble lord, who shall remain nameless but whose initials are RW and who controls the treasury, yeah, real subtle. Everyone knows exactly who's being attacked, and everyone's enjoying it immensely. But here's what's interesting. Alongside the sedition and the satire, there's genuine political education happening. The merchant next to you is explaining to a younger man how Parliament actually works. Not the official version where everyone nobly debates for the good of the realm, but the reality of patronage networks, bought votes and strategic alliances. This is information you won't find in any official source. the kind of practical political knowledge that comes from experience and observation. There's debate about specific legislation currently before Parliament, a tax bill maybe, or regulations on colonial trade. The men discussing it aren't just complaining, they're analysing, proposing alternatives, thinking through implications. Some of their ideas are terrible. Some are actually quite clever. None will ever reach the people who could actually implement them, but the exercise itself is valuable. Someone mentions the word republic, and several heads turn sharply. That's a dangerous word in England, evoking memories of the Civil War and Cromwell's Commonwealth. Monarchy is the established order. Questioning it is not taken lightly. The speaker quickly clarifies she was just explaining what happened in ancient Rome, purely historical interest, absolutely no contemporary parallels intended. Everyone relaxes, but the moment of tension was real. The political discussions circle and flow, moving from specific grievances to grand philosophical questions and back again. Should Parliament have more power relative to the Crown? Should there be limits on how long someone can serve as Prime Minister? Should voting rights be expanded beyond property owners? These aren't just academic questions, they're the fundamental issues that will eventually reshape British government, though nobody here knows that yet. Your grey-whiskered neighbour leans over again. Careful who you agree with too enthusiastically, he murmurs. That fellow by the door reported his own brother-in-law last year for Jacobite sympathies. Family means nothing when there's a reward offered, and just like that the danger becomes personal. You're not just observing political discourse, you're participating in it, and participation carries risk. Every laugh at a joke about the king, every nod of agreement with criticism of ministers, every moment of visible engagement, it's all potentially evidence. If someone decides you're worth investigating, the pamphlet continues its circuit. The political arguments continue their escalation. And somewhere, probably, an informer is taking notes. You paid a penny for coffee. What you didn't realize is that Penny also bought you admission to the best informal education system in London, possibly in all of Europe. Welcome to the Penny University, where the curriculum is whatever whoever's sitting near you happens to know, and the graduation requirement is simply staying awake long enough to absorb something useful. The gentleman across from you is currently explaining the principles of Newtonian physics to a rapt audience of 4, using a coffee cup, a tobacco pipe, and increasingly desperate hand gestures to illustrate gravitational attraction. He's getting about half of it right, which is better than nothing, and his listeners are genuinely engaged, asking questions that suggest they're actually trying to understand rather than just nodding politely. This is happening at the same time that the table behind you is hosting a debate about the proper translation of a Greek text, while the booth to your left features a ship's captain describing navigation by the stars in terms so practical and detailed that you're reasonably certain you could now sail from London to the Caribbean without getting completely lost. Probably, maybe don't test that theory. The range of knowledge being exchanged here is staggering. Philosophy, science, mathematics, languages, geography, history, law, medicine, theology. If someone in this room knows something about it, they're probably willing to share. Sometimes for free, out of pure enthusiasm for their subject. Sometimes in exchange for information flowing the other direction. Always loudly enough that anyone nearby can eavesdrop and learn. There's no formal structure, no syllabus, no professors with credentials. That fellow currently lecturing about astronomy, he might be a genuine scholar from Oxford, or he might be a self-taught amateur who read one book and is now presenting himself as an expert. You have to develop skill at distinguishing between actual knowledge and confident ignorance, which is an education in itself. A young man apprentice age, maybe 17-us, scribbling notes in a small leather-bound book, trying to capture the essence of a discussion about compound interest and investment strategies. His master probably sent him here specifically to learn practical mathematics that no formal school teaches. The coffeehouse is his classroom, these merchants his professors, and that penny his tuition for the day. The languages alone are worth the price of admission. You're hearing English, obviously, but also French, Latin thrown around in scholarly arguments, bits of Dutch from the merchant sailors, occasional Italian from someone discussing art or architecture. Want to learn a foreign language? Sit near the international traders and just listen. You'll pick up commercial vocabulary faster than any tutor could teach you. Someone's explaining chemistry now. Well, what passes for chemistry in 1742, which is still half alchemy and full of theories about elements and humours that will later prove completely wrong. But the process of inquiry is sound, even if the conclusions aren't. He's describing experiments, observations, attempts to understand why substances behave the way they do. The scientific method is being applied, even if the science itself is sketchy. Historians still argue whether the penny university concept actually provided valuable education or simply created an illusion of learning that made attendees feel smart without imparting useful knowledge. But you're watching a carpenter ask a natural philosopher about the structural properties of different woods, and the resulting conversation is genuinely advancing both men's understanding. The medical discussion nearby has devolved into argumental ways, a sign of actual learning happening. 3 men with 3 different theories about fever, each one citing authorities, observations, and personal experience. None of them is entirely right, but through argument they're refining their positions, acknowledging weaknesses, incorporating better evidence. This is education as dialectic, truth emerging through conflict. A book circulates through the room, someone's personal copy of something recent and popular, being passed from reader to reader. Books are expensive. Not everyone can afford their own library. But in the coffee house, one book can serve dozens of readers, each getting their turn, discussing passages, arguing interpretations. It's a lending library that runs on trust and coffee. The historical knowledge being shared ranges from accurate to completely fabricated, often in the same conversation. The gentleman explaining Roman military tactics definitely knows his Livy, but the one describing ancient Egypt is clearly just making things up based on vague rumours. The apprentice taking notes hasn't yet developed the critical thinking skills to distinguish between them, which means he's going to walk away with an interestingly mixed understanding of classical antiquity. You're learning simply by sitting here. You've already absorbed information about shipping routes, interest rate calculations, the proper way to address a letter to someone in Parliament, and why you should never invest in South American gold mines unless you enjoy losing money. None of this was explicitly taught to you. It's simply washed over you in the course of surrounding conversations, seeping into your brain through osmosis. The poets in the corner are discussing meter and rhyme schemes with intensity usually reserved for matters of life and death. They're reading passages aloud, critiquing each other's work with brutal honesty that would end friendships in any other context. But here, in the coffee house, such criticism is expected, even welcomed. They're all getting better through exposure to each other's techniques and criticisms. There's practical education too. Someone's explaining how to spot counterfeit coin-sourceful information in an era when currency varies wildly in quality and forgery is common. Another voice is describing the symptoms of smallpox versus measles, potentially life-saving knowledge. A third is providing detailed instructions for treating leather to make it waterproof. The quality control problem is real though. That confident-sounding gentleman explaining astronomy is now claiming that stars are holes in the celestial sphere through which heavenly light shines through, which is definitely not correct. But he's presenting it with such authority that several listeners are accepting it as fact. This is the risk of the penny university. No credentials required means no credentials checked. But here's the miracle: the system self-corrects. Another voice pipes up, challenging the celestial sphere theory, presenting alternative evidence. A debate erupts. Both sides marshal their arguments. The listeners get to evaluate competing claims and draw their own conclusions. It's messy and imperfect, but it's how knowledge advances through challenge and response, argument and evidence. Your coffee's gone cold while you've been listening to a master craftsman explain the mathematics of arch construction. You signal for another cup, not because you want more terrible coffee, but because leaving means missing whatever lesson comes next. The education is just getting started. So you've been assuming this entire time that coffee is the only option, but you're starting to notice that not everyone around you is drinking that murky brown liquid. The wealthy gentleman by the fireplace is sipping something darker, thicker, with a rich smell that cuts through the tobacco smoke. That's chocolate, and it costs considerably more than your penny coffee. Chocolate in 742 isn't the sweet, milky beverage you're imagining. It's closer to liquid bitterness with exotic spices, served hot and thick enough that you practically have to chew it. The cocoa beans come from Spanish colonies in Central and South America, shipped across the Atlantic at great expense, processed into a paste, then mixed with hot water or milk, and whatever additives the proprietor favor cinnamon, vanilla, sometimes pepper, for those who like their beverages aggressively spiced. The man drinking it is making a statement with every sip. I can afford luxuries. I have refined tastes. I'm cosmopolitan enough to enjoy foreign delicacies. It's conspicuous consumption in a cup, and everyone in the room knows it. A single cup of chocolate might cost sixpence, or more ZX times the price of coffee, putting it firmly in the territory of the prosperous. But here's the thing about chocolate that makes it interesting. It's marketed as medicinal. Supposedly, it's good for the digestion, provides energy, even has aphrodisiac properties if you believe the more enthusiastic sellers. The reality is that it's thick, bitter, often slightly grainy from imperfect processing, and requires substantial sugar to be remotely palatable. That gentleman by the fireplace is adding multiple spoonfuls, turning his medicinal beverage into something that more closely resembles dessert. Then there's tea, which is staging its own quiet revolution in the corner. A group of merchants are drinking it instead of coffee, and you can immediately tell because the smell is completely different, lighter, more floral, with none of coffee's aggressive earthiness. Tea came to England from China via the Dutch East India Company, and it's been slowly growing in popularity, though it hasn't yet achieved the dominance it will later claim. The tea these men are drinking is black tea. Green tea exists, but is less common brewed, strong enough to strip paint, and served in small ceramic cups that look delicate compared to the heavy coffee mugs. They're adding sugar and milk, creating a beverage that's actually pleasant to drink, which already gives it an advantage over the coffee situation. Tea costs more than coffee, but less than chocolate, positioning it as the middle-class beverage of choice. It's respectable without being ostentatious, exotic without being intimidating, and it doesn't leave grounds between your teeth. The tea drinkers look slightly smug about their choice, as if they've discovered a secret that the coffee devotees haven't yet figured out. Historians still argue whether tea's eventual dominance over coffee in English culture stemmed from genuine preference or from aggressive marketing by the East India Company, combined with consistently terrible coffeehouse coffee quality. But watching these merchants contentedly sip their tea while you struggle with grainy coffee residue, you're leaning toward coffee, was just that bad. There's also something called sherbet being advertised on the wall, which is not at all what you're thinking. This isn't frozen dessert, it's a drink made from fruit, sugar, and water, sometimes with exotic additions like rose water or orange flower water. It's supposed to be cooling and refreshing, popular in the Ottoman Empire, and now making its way into fashionable London establishments. You've never actually seen anyone order sherbet in here, which suggests either it's not very popular or the proprietor is optimistically advertising something he doesn't actually stock. The latter seems more likely given the general chaos of coffeehouse operations. Still, the promise of it adds an international flair to the menu, suggesting this establishment is cosmopolitan enough to offer Turkish luxuries, even if those luxuries are mostly theoretical. Some coffee houses serve alcohol tuali, wine, spirits though. This one seems to focus primarily on the non-alcoholic beverages that are supposedly improving English productivity and sobriety. The whole point of coffee houses, according to their advocates, is that they're alternatives to ale houses, places where men can gather and actually think clearly rather than drinking themselves into stupidity. That said, you notice a few patrons who are definitely spiking their coffee with something stronger from flasks concealed in their coats. Nobody comments on this because nobody wants to be the person who ruins the fun. The pretense of sobriety is maintained even when the reality is somewhat more flexible. The coffee boy appears at your elbow again. Another coffee? Or perhaps tea today? He's reading your expression, which apparently broadcasts, "This coffee is terrible," clearly enough for a 12-year-old to interpret. You're tempted the tea does look more appealing, but there's something stubborn in you that insists on sticking with coffee. You paid to enter a coffee house, not a tea house. Coffee, you say, and immediately regret it when he returns with another cup of grainy punishment. The chocolate drinker has attracted an audience of sortsmen who are watching him with expressions ranging from envy to calculation, probably working out whether their finances could stretch to occasional chocolate consumption. It's aspirational drinking, setting a standard that others hope to reach. Someone orders what the proprietor calls coffee with milk and sugar, which is apparently becoming fashionable in some circles. The addition of milk makes the coffee less aggressively bitter, while sugar masks some of the burnt flavors. It's probably the most sensible way to consume coffeehouse coffee, turning it from punishment into merely unpleasant medicine. There are also various questionable tonics and elixirs available, advertised on handwritten cards tacked to the walls. Dr. Johnson's restorative tincture, probably alcohol with herbs. Lady Pemberton's digestive water, unknown composition, possibly dangerous. The coffeehouse is part cafe, part pharmacy, part snake oil dispensary. The menu, such as it is, reflects the coffeehouse's position at the intersection of commerce, empire, and aspiration. Every beverage represents global trade networks: coffee from Arabia or Java, tea from China, chocolate from Central America, sugar from Caribbean plantations worked by enslaved people. You're drinking imperialism, basically, though nobody phrases it quite that way. Your second cup of coffee is, if anything, worse than the first. The grounds are coarser, the liquid more bitter, the temperature somehow both scalding and lukewarm simultaneously. You watch the tea drinkers with increasing envy, wondering if stubbornness is really worth this level of discomfort. But you're committed now. You came to a coffee house for coffee, and coffee you shall drink, even if it tastes like someone punished dirt for crimes against flavor. The things we do for pride. Now take a moment to actually watch the people who make this entire chaotic operation function, not the patrons arguing about philosophy or negotiating shipping contracts, but the nearly invisible workforce threading through the crowd with remarkable efficiency and absolutely zero recognition for their efforts. That coffee boy who's been serving you, he's maybe 12 years old, possibly younger, and he's been on his feet since before dawn. He's navigating a room packed with bodies carrying trays laden with hot beverages, collecting coins, dodging elbows and gesticulating hands, remembering who ordered what, and somehow impossibly he hasn't spilled a single drop on anyone important enough to complain about it. Watch him move. It's like watching someone who's developed a sixth sense for human traffic patterns. He anticipates when someone's going to stand up before they've consciously decided to move. He finds gaps in the crowd that don't appear to exist. He's memorized the preferred drinks of the regulars, the tipping habits of the generous, and the faces of the troublemakers who'll try to leave without paying. His hands are probably scalded from handling hot ceramic all day. His feet ache from the constant movement on these hard wooden floors. His lungs are full of second-hand tobacco. Smoke he'll likely have a persistent cough by age 20 if he survives that long. And his compensation for this? Room and board, probably in some cramped attic above the coffee house, and maybe a few pennies a week in actual wages. Tips? That's not really a custom yet. You pay for your coffee, and the boy gets whatever his master deems appropriate. There's a hierarchy even among the staff. The boy serving you is at the bottom an apprentice or servant learning the trade. Above him is an older youth, maybe 16, who handles the more demanding customers and manages the flow of service during rush periods. He's the one who intervenes when disputes arise, who sweet-talks the impatient gentleman demanding faster service, who knows exactly how to diffuse tension before it escalates into something the proprietor has to handle personally. Then there's the man at the copper pot, the actual coffee maker. He's been roasting and grinding beans since 4 a.m, tending that fire, ladling out cup after cup with mechanical precision. His role is crucial and utterly thankless. Make the coffee too weak and customers complain. Make it too strong and they still complain. There's no winning, only degrees of acceptable failure. He's probably the proprietor's brother or cousin, someone trusted enough to handle the core product but not prosperous enough to own his own establishment. Historians still argue whether coffeehouse workers were essentially indentured servants or whether they occupied a marginally better position in the labour hierarchy, but watching this boy dodge a merchant's carelessly swung arm while balancing 3 full cups, you're pretty sure the distinction wouldn't matter much to him. There's a woman working till you spot her through a doorway that presumably leads to some kind of kitchen or preparation area. She's older, maybe the proprietor's wife or mother, handling the chocolate preparation and managing the food side of operations. Women don't serve in the main room, that would be scandalous, but they're absolutely part of the labour keeping this place running. She's just less visible, relegated to the back regions where respectable female labour can occur without challenging social norms. The coffee boy just performed what can only be described as a miracle of spatial awareness. He somehow squeezed between 2 men engaged in heated debate, neither of whom noticed his presence, delivered coffee to someone 3 bodies deep in the crowd, collected payment, and emerged unscathed. If Olympic events existed for navigating human obstacles while carrying hot liquids, this kid would medal. Nobody thanks him, nobody even looks at him really. He's functional furniture, as invisible as the benches everyone sits on. The merchant you've been sitting next to has ordered 4 cups over the past hour and probably couldn't describe the boy who served them if his life depended on it. The older server is currently dealing with a difficult customer, someone who claims his coffee was cold and wants a replacement without paying again. You can see the calculation happening. Is this person important enough that antagonizing them would hurt business? Will giving them free coffee encourage others to try the same scam? How does he resolve this without bothering the proprietor? He chooses appeasement, bringing a fresh cup with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes, and the customer accepts it as his due without acknowledgement. There's a rhythm to the service that you're starting to recognize. The morning rush when merchants arrive to read newspapers and conduct early business. The midday surge when everyone wants a quick cup before returning to their work. The afternoon philosophers and poets who nurse single servings for hours. The early evening crowd conducting last-minute deals before heading home. The staff knows these rhythms intimately, preparing accordingly, managing flow without any modern concepts of scheduling or planning. The physical demands are brutal. Constant standing, constant movement, heavy trays, hot liquids, difficult customers. 0 breaks during busy periods. And if you're the coffee boy, you're probably also responsible for hauling water from the well, carrying coal for the fire, emptying those chamber pots nobody wants to think about, sweeping floors, and doing whatever other tasks the proprietor assigns. Your coffee boy just intercepted someone trying to leave without paying. Not aggressively, just materializing in the doorway with hand outstretched, polite but immovable. The would-be thief looks embarrassed, pays up, and hurries out. The boy pockets the penny and moves on without celebration. This probably happens multiple times per day. The truly invisible workers are the ones you'll never see, whoever cleans this place after hours, who empties the waste, who scrubs the floors and tries to manage the accumulated filth of daily operations. That work is probably done by the lowest paid, least regarded people in the entire operation, possibly children even younger than the coffee boys, possibly women considered too old or too poor for better employment. And yet, without this invisible army, the entire coffeehouse system collapses. No coffee gets served, no deals get made, no penny university operates. These workers are the infrastructure supporting England's commercial and intellectual revolution, and their reward is poverty-level wages and complete social invisibility. The coffee boy appears at your elbow again, somehow knowing you've finished your cup even though you barely noticed yourself. Another, sir. You should probably tip him. Except that's not really done, and you'd just embarrassed both of you. Here's something you've probably noticed by now, or maybe you haven't, because it's so normalized in 1742 that it barely registers as notable. This entire room is male. Every single patron, every voice in every debate, every person negotiating deals or reading newspapers or arguing about philosophy, all men. Nothing but men as far as the eye can see. The absence of women isn't accidental. It's deliberate, enforced by social conventions so powerful it might as well be law. Respectable women don't go to coffee houses. Period. The very act of a woman entering this space, sitting on these benches, ordering coffee, participating in conversation, would be scandalous enough to damage her reputation, possibly beyond repair. Why? Well, the official explanation is that coffee houses are inappropriate for delicate female sensibilities. The smoke, the crude language, the political discussions, the proximity to strange men, it's all supposedly too coarse, too masculine, too dangerous for proper ladies. Women belong at home, managing households, not out in public spaces, arguing about tariff policy with merchants they've never been formally introduced to. The unofficial explanation is that men kind of like having spaces where women aren't present to judge them, moderate them, or remind them to behave like civilized human beings. Coffee houses are refuges from domestic responsibility, places where you can be as loud, argumentative, and intellectually messy as you want without your wife giving you that look that says, "Really? This is who you're choosing to be?" There was actually a petition back in 1674, the Women's Petition Against Coffee, where women complained that their husbands were spending all their time and money in coffee houses instead of at home where they belonged. The petition claimed coffee made men impotent and useless, that it was destroying marriages and family life, that these establishments were luring good husbands into idleness and dissipation. It was part genuine grievance, part satirical commentary, and entirely ignored by the men who had no intention of giving up their coffee houses. But here's where it gets interesting. The absence of respectable women doesn't mean no women at all. Look more carefully at that shadowy figure near the back, the one in the worn dress with the low neckline. That's a prostitute, taking advantage of the fact that coffee houses are full of men with money and time to kill. She's tolerated barely because she's not claiming to be respectable. She knows her place in the social hierarchy, and that place happens to include access to coffee houses that proper ladies would never dare enter. The woman you glimpsed earlier through the kitchen doorway, the proprietor's wife or mother, she's allowed here because she's working, not socializing. Her presence is functional, not social. She's part of the establishment's operation, like the furniture or the coffee pot. Nobody considers her participation in the coffeehouse experience as contradicting the men-only rule because she's not really participating, just facilitating. Historians still argue whether the exclusion of women from coffeehouse culture genuinely prevented them from participating in Enlightenment discourse, or whether they simply developed parallel networks of intellectual exchange in salons and private homes. But either way, the Penny University is charging admission that half the population literally cannot pay, regardless of whether they have the actual penny. There are scandalous, delicious rumors about certain daring women who disguise themselves as men to sneak into coffee houses. You've heard stories about ladies of quality who want to experience the intellectual excitement firsthand, who bind their chests and wear their brothers' clothes and sit in corners trying not to draw attention while soaking up prohibited knowledge. Whether these stories are true or just urban legends designed to titillate is unclear, but they persist. Occasionally, very occasionally, a woman of high enough social status can bend the rules through sheer force of aristocratic privilege. A duchess might enter a coffee house with her husband and nobody will directly challenge her because challenging a duchess is socially suicidal. But she'll still face whispers, shocked looks, and a reputation for eccentricity that will follow her through every drawing room in London. The irony is rich. Coffee houses celebrate themselves as democratic spaces where rank matters less than wit, where anyone can join the conversation, nigh one, that is, with the right anatomy. The radical egalitarianism that allows dukes to sit beside dock workers apparently has very firm limits when it comes to gender. Your merchant neighbor notices you looking toward the kitchen doorway. The proprietor's mother, he explains, unprompted. Runs a tight ship, that one. Handles all the accounts. Manages the supplies. Probably makes more decisions about this place than her son does. But you'll never see her out here. He gestures at the main room. Wouldn't be proper. So she's competent enough to run the business, but not respectable enough to occupy the space that business operates in. The logic is twisted, but it's the logic of your era, and questioning it too loudly would mark you as dangerously radical. Some coffee houses cater specifically to women, or at least they're supposed to. These are more respectable establishments where ladies can meet for tea and chocolate in separate, carefully chaperoned rooms. But they're not really coffee houses in the same sense. They don't have the same energy, the same mixture of classes, the same dangerous political discourse. They're more like tea rooms with delusions of grandeur. The prostitute near the back just laughed at something too loud, too familiar, and several heads turned with expressions ranging from interest to disapproval. She's walking a dangerous line, trying to attract business without being so obvious that the proprietor throws her out for lowering the establishment's tone, which is hilarious, given that the establishment's tone includes men spitting tobacco juice on the floor and using chamber pots behind a curtain. Here's what women are missing by being excluded from this space: business networks that could advance their families' fortunes, political information that could inform their opinions and actions, educational opportunities through the penny university, intellectual stimulation from debate and argument, social connections across class lines, all of it reserved for men by men, because apparently democracy has limits, and those limits are determined by what's between your legs. The women at home, your wife included there, probably conducting their own version of social and intellectual exchange. They're visiting each other, sharing information, forming networks of mutual support and knowledge transmission. But those networks operate within much narrower confines, restricted to parlours and drawing rooms, limited to people of similar social standing, lacking the anarchic mixing that makes coffee houses so intellectually productive. There are women writers, women thinkers, women who contribute to the intellectual life of the nation. But they're doing it despite being excluded from spaces like this, not because they have access to them. They're publishing anonymously or under male pseudonyms, conducting their education through correspondence and borrowed books, finding ways around barriers rather than being welcomed through open doors. The coffee boy weaves past the prostitute without acknowledging her existence, which is probably the safest approach for someone of his age and status. She's invisible to most people here, simultaneously too visible and not visible enough, present but not permitted, tolerated but not accepted. You finish your coffee, still surrounded entirely by men, and realize that this vaunted democracy you've been experiencing is actually an oligarchy of gender. Progressive for its time, maybe, but still profoundly limited in who gets to participate in the revolution. So you've been assuming all coffee houses are basically the same sticky floors, terrible coffee, argumentative patrons, but you're starting to hear references to other establishments that suggest a much more complex ecosystem. The man next to you just mentioned meeting someone at Will's tomorrow, and the reverence in his voice suggests Will's is something special. Not this establishment clearly, but somewhere with status. London has hundreds of coffee houses by 1742, but a handful have achieved legendary status, each developing its own distinct personality, its own particular clientele, its own unwritten rules about who belongs and who's just visiting. These aren't just coffee houses, they're institutions, tribes, almost separate nations within the larger coffeehouse republic. Will's is the literary establishment, the place where writers go to be seen being writers. It's located in Covent Garden, and if you have any aspirations toward poetry or drama, you need to show your face there eventually. The ghost of John Dryden still haunts the place. Figuratively speaking, he held court there for decades until his death back in 1700, and his favourite winter seat by the fireplace is still referred to as Dryden's chair, even though the man himself is long gone. The current literary lions gather there to read their work aloud, savage each other's efforts, and form the kinds of alliances and feuds that will dominate London's cultural scene for the next decade. Alexander Pope was a regular before he got too famous for Coffeehouse society. Jonathan Swift stopped by when he was in London. The young Samuel Johnson will show up in a few years, awkward and brilliant, and destined to become the most famous literary figure of his age. But here's the thing about wills. It's intimidating as hell if you're not already part of the literary scene. The conversations move fast, referencing texts and authors you're expected to already know. The wit is sharp enough to draw blood. If you can't keep up, you'll be dismissed with the kind of polite contempt that literary types specialize in. It's a penny university, sure, but the curriculum is advanced and the professors don't believe in remedial education. Then there's Buttons, which started as Will's main rival and has developed its own distinct character. Daniel Button himself, the proprietor, installed a lion's head letterbox where people can submit essays, poems, and literary criticism anonymously. It's genius marketing, really. The submissions get read aloud to general amusement or approval, creating a kind of democratic literary culture where anyone can contribute without revealing their identity. Buttons attracts a slightly different crowd than Will's younger, more diverse, less establishment. The Whig political faction claims it as their unofficial headquarters, which means the political discussions have a particular partisan flavour. If you want to hear the latest attacks on the Tories, Buttons is your place. If you're actually a Tory, maybe choose a different coffeehouse. The Grecian is where the intellectuals goth, natural philosophers, the mathematicians, the people who think about things for a living. It's near the Royal Society and the British Museum, which means you're likely to encounter actual scientists conducting actual research, not just amateurs with opinions. The conversations here lean heavily toward the empirical and experimental, with less poetry and more physics. Historians still argue whether the specialization of different coffeehouses created genuine intellectual communities or simply reinforced existing social and professional divisions under the guise of open discourse. But walk into the Grecian and try to start a conversation about poetry, and you'll quickly learn that community standards are very real. Lloyd's, which you heard mentioned earlier, is the maritime and insurance coffeehouse. Ship captains, merchants, underwriters. If your business involves vessels and cargo, Lloyd's is where you conduct it. They post shipping news on the walls, track vessel arrivals and departures, and the proprietor, Edward Lloyd, publishes his own shipping newsletter that's become essential reading for anyone in maritime trade. The modern insurance giant Lloyd's of London will eventually emerge from this coffeehouse, though nobody here knows that yet. There's also Jonathan's, which is basically the stock market in coffeehouse form. The stock jobbers congregate there to buy and sell shares, manipulate prices, spread rumours, and engage in what will eventually be recognised as securities fraud, but is currently just considered sharp business practice. The atmosphere is frantic, voices raised in argument over valuations, fortunes being made and lost over cups of cooling coffee. Child's Coffeehouse attracts clergymen and scholars, the respectable intellectual set who want serious discussion without the rowdier elements you find elsewhere. The tone is more subdued, the language more careful, the topics more theological. It's probably the least fun of the major coffeehouses. But if you want to debate the finer points of Anglican doctrine without anyone shouting crude jokes, Child's is your destination. The Smyrna has a reputation for attracting the artistic, crowd painters, sculptors, architects. The walls are covered with sketches and drawings, some brilliant, some terrible, all contributed by patrons who couldn't afford to pay for their coffee in actual money. It's chaotic and creative, and probably a fire hazard given all the paper tacked to every available surface. Here's something nobody tells you. Choosing which coffeehouse to frequent is choosing an identity. You can't really be a Will's regular and a Lloyd's regular simultaneously. They serve different purposes, attract different people, operate in different worlds. You have to pick your tribe, align yourself with particular networks and communities. Your grey-whiskered companion has opinions about this. Wills is for pretentious word jugglers who think they're cleverer than they are, he declares. Buttons is for political fanatics who care more about party than truth. The Grecian is tolerable if you enjoy being made to feel stupid by men who've actually read books. He gestures around the current establishment. Here, at least, we're honest about being ordinary. But you've noticed that even this ordinary coffee house has its own character, its own regular crowd, its own unwritten rules. Maybe it's not as famous as Will's or as specialised as Lloyd's, but it still has identity, still attracts people who fit a particular profile. The coffeehouse ecosystem is more complex than you realised. Each establishment is its own microculture with distinct values, vocabularies and hierarchies. Together they form a network covering London, creating spaces where different types of knowledge, different kinds of people, different visions of society can flourish. And you're sitting in one small node of this vast network, drinking terrible coffee and wondering which tribe you belong to. You've been here for a few hours now, and you're starting to notice something interesting. The coffeehouse isn't static. It's breathing, changing, cycling through distinct phases like some kind of caffeinated organism responding to the rhythms of urban life. The crowd that filled this room when you first arrived isn't the same crowd occupying it now, and neither group will resemble whoever shows up in another few hours. The morning rush which you missed by arriving in the afternoon apparently begins around 7 or 8 o'clock. That's when the merchants arrive, fresh from their homes or warehouses, ready to conduct the day's essential business before the rest of London properly wakes up. Your grey-whiskered friend describes it with something approaching religious reverence. The morning crowd is serious, people doing serious business. Oh, no poets, no philosophers, no time wasters. Just commerce. Those early hours are when the real money changes hands, when shipping contracts are signed, when investment decisions are made. The merchants arrive with clear agendas, specific people they need to see, deals they need to close. They drink their coffee quickly flavour, doesn't matter when you're using it as fuel, and they leave as soon as business concludes. Efficiency is the morning's defining characteristic. The newspapers arrive during the morning rush too, delivered by boys who make the rounds of multiple coffee houses, their satchels full of fresh printed news. The arrival of papers causes a temporary surge in activity as everyone scrambles to be among the first to read them. Information is currency, and getting it early provides competitive advantage. A merchant who learns about a ship sinking before his rivals can adjust his investments accordingly. Someone who reads about political developments can position himself to benefit from the consequences. By mid-morning, the character shifts. The urgent business has been conducted, and the crowd thins slightly as merchants return to their counting houses and warehouses. This is when the lawyers arrive, using the coffeehouse as a satellite office for meeting clients who can't afford formal chambers. Small tables become negotiating spaces. Contracts are drafted on portable writing desks. Legal advice is dispensed for the price of coffee, plus modest fees. The midday period where you currently find yourself is the most diverse. This is when the coffeehouse truly becomes the penny university, when conversation matters more than commerce. The poets and philosophers emerge from wherever they spend their mornings, ready to debate and declaim. The students and apprentices sneak away from their masters for an hour of freedom. The gentlemen who have no pressing obligations wander in to see who's about and what's being discussed. Historians still argue whether the midday coffeehouse crowd represented England's intellectual elite or merely its idle class with pretensions toward learning, but the arguments you're overhearing about natural philosophy and political theory suggest at least some genuine intellectual activity is happening. The energy is different, now, louder, more argumentative, more playful. People have time to waste, and they're wasting it enthusiastically. The debates stretch on without resolution because resolution isn't really the point. The point is the debate itself, the performance of intellect, the social connection forged through shared argument. Food appears during midday, carried in by vendors or prepared in that mysterious back kitchen. Pies, mostly meat pies, fish pies, whatever's cheap and portable. The smell of baked pastry mingles with the coffee and tobacco smoke, adding yet another layer to the sensory assault. Some patrons eat lunch here, treating the coffee house as a complete dining experience rather than just a beverage stop. The afternoon is when things get weird. This is nap time for respectable society, but coffee houses don't close, and the people who inhabit them during afternoon hours are a peculiar mix. There are the all-day regulars who've been here since morning and show no signs of leaving, their table claimed as personal territory. There are the insomniacs and night shift workers for whom afternoon is morning, and there are the people who don't quite fit anywhere else in society's schedule. The writers working on perpetually unfinished manuscripts, the inventors with schemes they're convinced will change the world, the confidence men looking for marks among the drowsy afternoon crowd. The pace slows, conversations become more rambling, less focused. The tobacco smoke thickens because there's less movement to disperse it. If you fall asleep in your seat during afternoon hours, people will just work around you rather than wake you up. It's the coffeehouse's dreaming phase, still technically open for business, but operating in a lower key. Then comes early evening, and the energy surges again as workers finish their day. The clerks and shopkeepers arrive, ready to relax after long hours of labour. They're louder than the morning crowd, more boisterous, treating the coffeehouse as reward for surviving another day of drudgery. The conversations are less about high commerce and more about local gossip, workplace complaints, and the kind of crude jokes that make the afternoon philosophers wince. This is also prime time for the political radicals. Something about the approaching darkness makes seditious talk feel safer, even though it's probably not. The pamphlets circulate more freely. The criticisms of government become more explicit. The revolutionary fervour rises, along with the evening crowd's volume. If authorities are going to raid a coffee house looking for troublemakers, early evening is prime hunting time. The proprietor has to work harder during the evening rush, managing the increased chaos while trying to extract maximum profit from the crowd. More coffee gets sold during these hours than any other time except morning, but the evening patrons are also more likely to cause problems arguments that escalate toward violence, customers who try to leave without paying, general rowdiness that threatens to get the establishment shut down. By full night, many coffee houses close, their proprietors exhausted and their supplies depleted. A few stay open later, catering to the night owls and the people with nowhere better to go. These later night hours have their own strange, culture quieter, more intimate, populated by insomniacs and shift workers and people avoiding their homes for various reasons. Your merchant neighbour checks a pocket watch. Nearly 5 o'clock, he announces. Evening crowd will start arriving soon. Gets too loud for my taste. I prefer the serious morning hours. He stands, gathering his belongings, nodding farewell to various acquaintances. His departure is your first clear sign that the coffeehouse's daily rhythm is about to shift again. Already you can hear different voices arriving, feel the energy changing. The coffeehouse is transforming around you, same space but different character, like watching an actor change costumes between scenes. You've been here for one phase of its daily cycle. The question is whether you'll stay for the next. Now that you've settled in and the afternoon crowd is in full swing, you notice something you initially overlooked. Not everyone here is engaged in high-minded intellectual discourse or serious business negotiations. Look to your left and you'll see 2 men hunched over a chessboard, so focused on their game that they haven't touched their coffee in 20 minutes. Look right, and there's a card game happening with actual money on the table, coins stacked beside each player's hand. The coffee house isn't just a centre of commerce and learning, it's also a playground for adults who need distraction from the grinding monotony of 18th century existence. And what better distraction than games, gambling, and the endless circulation of gossip that makes everyone feel connected to scandals they have no actual involvement in? The chess players are utterly absorbed in their match, which has apparently been going on for the better part of an hour. Chess is the intellectual's game of choice, requiring no equipment beyond a board and pieces, offering infinite complexity, and providing a socially acceptable framework for competition that doesn't involve physical violence. The better coffee houses keep chess sets available for patrons, understanding that a good match can keep customers in their seat sand buying coffee for hours. Watch the players' faces. One is young, maybe 25, dressed well enough to suggest merchant class or minor gentry. The other is older, shabby genteel, with the kind of worn elegance that suggests better days now past. The younger man is sweating slightly, his hand hovering over a knight while he calculates consequences, 3 moves ahead. The older man sits back with the confidence of someone who's already won and is just waiting for his opponent to realize it. Chess in coffee houses isn't just recreation, it's performance. Other patrons gather to watch, offering unsolicited advice that the players studiously ignore. "The bishop! Move your bishop!" someone shouts, and the young player's eyes flicker toward the suggested piece before returning to his original plan. In coffee houses, everyone's an expert, even at games they're not playing. The card players are a different breed entirely. They're playing something that looks like an ancestor of poker there, a betting, bluffing, and the kind of studied casualness that suggests serious money is at stake. 5 men around a table, each one trying to read the other's tells while maintaining their own poker faces. Literal poker faces, though the game itself might be called something else in 1742. Gambling is technically illegal in many contexts, but coffee houses occupy that familiar grey area where authorities know it's happening and mostly choose to ignore it. As long as the stakes stay reasonable and nobody gets violent when they lose, the authorities have bigger problems to worry about. Besides, half the magistrates probably gamble in coffee houses themselves. The stakes at this particular table look modest shillings rather than pounds, serious enough to matter, but not ruinous if you lose. That's the sweet spot for coffeehouse gambling, high enough to be exciting, low enough that you can come back tomorrow after you lose. The professional gamblers who would fleece you for everything you own generally operate in more upscale establishments. Historians still argue whether coffeehouse gambling represented relatively harmless recreation or fed into broader patterns of addiction and financial ruin that characterized Georgian society, but the man currently cursing as he throws down a losing hand suggests at least some emotional investment in the outcome. Beyond the formal games, there's backgammon being played in the corner, the rapid clicking of pieces on wood providing rhythmic background noise to all the conversations. Backgammon is faster than chess, more luck-based, perfect for people who want the thrill of competition without the mental exhaustion of deep strategic thinking. Dice rattle, pieces move, money changes hands with casual regularity. There are also dice games happening at various tables, though these are more explicitly gambling than gaming. Men roll for coins. The simplest possible wager-high roll wins. It's pure chance, which somehow makes it more democratic than chess or cards where skill provides advantage. Anyone can win at dice, even the fool who can't remember which suit is trumps. But here's where the coffeehouse really shines as entertainment, the gossip. Oh, the gossip. It flows through the room like a river, pooling in eddies of conversation, spreading from table to table with the speed of wildfire and approximately the same regard for accuracy. Did you hear about Lord Pemberton's daughter? The question comes from somewhere behind you, delivered in that conspiratorial half-whisper that's actually designed to be overheard by maximum people. Ran off with a French dancing master. The family is mortified. Whether this is true is almost irrelevant. The story is too good not to spread, and within minutes you'll hear it circulating through the room with embellishments. By tomorrow, Lord Pemberton will have disowned her, challenged the dancing master to a duel, and possibly died of chaminone, of which actually happened, but all of which make the story better. Coffee houses are information networks, and gossip is information at its most entertaining. Who's been seen with whom? Which merchant is overextended financially? What scandalous behaviour occurred at last night's party? Who's having an affair with whose wife? It's all here, spreading at the speed of conversation, impossible to verify and therefore impossible to contradict. The amazing thing is how much of this gossip is actually accurate. Not the embellished versions that circulate after multiple retellings, but the original kernels of truth. Servants talk, clerks overhear things. Merchants notice patterns in their competitors' behavior. All this information flows into the coffeehouse, gets processed by collective analysis, and emerges as community knowledge. You're hearing right now about a bankruptcy that apparently hasn't been publicly announced yet. Some silk merchant who overextended on Dutch imports and can't cover his debts. The man sharing this information is being deliberately vague about his sources, but several listeners are making mental notes to avoid doing business with the merchant in question. By tomorrow, the merchant will find his credit mysteriously evaporated, all because of a conversation in a coffeehouse that he wasn't present for. Political gossip is even juicier. Who's in favour with the king? Which minister is about to be dismissed? What really happened at the last parliamentary session? Some of this comes from clerks who work in government offices and can't resist sharing insider knowledge. Some comes from servants who overhear their master's private conversations. All of it is technically confidential and absolutely none of it stays that way. The chess match just concluded. The older man won, as he apparently knew he would, and the younger player is looking slightly sick as he pushes coins across the table. They were playing for stakes apparently, though modest ones. The winner accepts his prize with gracious magnanimity that probably stings more than gloating would. Someone started another card game at a newly vacated table. Who's in? The call goes out and 3 men immediately claim seats, eager for distraction, willing to risk their money on the turn of cards. A backgammon player just rolled double sixes and whooped with joy, drawing annoyed looks from the philosophers trying to discuss lock at the next table. The collision of leisure and learning, gambling and philosophy, all happening in the same cramped space. The gossip continues its circulation. You're now hearing about a duel that supposedly happened this morning. Gentleman versus gentleman over some insult to honor. One version claims both survived. Another insists someone died. A third suggests the whole thing was called off at the last minute. All 3 versions are being told as absolute fact by people who definitely weren't there. You could spend all day here just playing games and absorbing gossip, never conducting any business or learning anything useful, and honestly, plenty of people do exactly that. Let's address something you've been trying to ignore for the past few hours. You can barely see across the room anymore. Not because your vision is failing, but because the tobacco smoke has reached critical mass, transforming the atmosphere from breathable air with some smoke to smoke with occasional pockets of breathable air. You're not just in a coffee house anymore, you're inside someone's lungs. Every single man in this room, with maybe 2 exceptions, is nursing a clay pipe. Long-stemmed, fragile, cheap enough to be disposable, these pipes are the defining accessory of coffeehouse culture. They cost a penny or 2, break constantly, and produce enough smoke to cure meat if you packed it close enough to the source. Some coffee houses provide house pipes for custom-used pipes, mind you, passed from mouth to mouth with minimal cleaning beyond a quick wipe. The hygiene implications are horrifying, but apparently tobacco smoke is a powerful disinfectant, or at least that's what people tell themselves. Watch the man across from you pack his pipe. He's using a small knife to shred tobacco from a pressed cacatha. Tobacco comes in solid blocks that you carve pieces from, then rub between your palms to break into smokable shreds. It's a ritual, almost meditative, this preparation. The tobacco goes into the pipe bowl, tamped down with a thumb or the knife handle, not too tight or it won't draw, not too loose or it'll burn too fast. Lighting it requires either leaning into the fireplace with your pipe extended at awkward angles or waiting for the coffee boy to come around with a lit taper. The boy is currently making his rounds, touching flame to pipe after pipe, creating little eruptions of smoke with each successful lighting. He's probably inhaling more second-hand smoke than the actual smokers at this point, which explains the persistent cough you keep hearing from him. The first few puffs are always the harsher straw, bitter, enough to make newcomers cough and sputter. But the men around you are drawing deeply, holding the smoke in their mouths before exhaling clouds that add to the general atmospheric disaster. Some smoke for pleasure, others out of habit, many because it's simply what you do in a coffee house. Not smoking would be like not drinking coffee, technically permitted, but socially odd. The pipes themselves are works of accidental art. Plain white clay, moulded in simple designs, sometimes stamped with the maker's mark. The stems are longer foot or more, which supposedly cools the smoke before it reaches your mouth, though cool is relative when you're inhaling burning plant matter. The bowls are small, holding maybe 15 minutes worth of tobacco if you're not puffing constantly. And they break. Oh, how they break. Oh, how they break. You've already seen 2 pipes shatter, today only dropped. 1 knocked from someone's hand during an enthusiastic gesture. The stems snap if you look at them wrong. The proprietor just sweeps the fragments into a pile with all the other detritus on the floor, where they crunch under boots and add to the general texture of coffeehouse ambiance. Historians still argue whether clay pipe smoking contributed to the coffeehouse's intellectual atmosphere or simply gave men something to do with their hands while talking, but the physical act of smoking definitely changes conversational rhythm. You speak, puff, let someone else talk while you draw on your pipe, exhale, respond. It's slower, more measured, with natural pauses built into the dialogue. The tobacco itself varies wildly in quality. The gentleman by the fireplace is smoking Virginian, supposedly the premium stuff from American colonies. It smells sweeter, burns smoother, costs considerably more. Your neighbour's tobacco is probably the cheap domestic blend harsher, more acrid but functional. Some poor souls are smoking reconstituted tobacco, basically the sweepings and scraps pressed into cakes and sold to those who can't afford better. The smoke creates layers in the room, visible strata of grey and blue that hang at different heights depending on air temperature and movement. At eye level, you're in the thick of it, breathing smoke with every inhale, whether you're smoking or not. Your clothes are absorbing it, your hair, your skin. You will smell like a tobacco barn for days after leaving here, no matter how thoroughly you wash. There's an art to smoking socially. Blowing smoke directly in someone's face is rude, though given the general density, it's hard to avoid entirely. Some men blow smoke rings, showing off their technique, creating wobbly circles that drift upward before dissipating. Others just exhale wherever, adding to the general cloud without artistry or consideration. The pipes also serve as props, punctuation marks for arguments. A man makes his point, taps his pipe against the table for emphasize gently, because they break then puffs smugly, while his opponent formulates a response. Or someone uses their pipe as a pointer, gesturing with the stem to emphasize arguments, occasionally sending ash flying in unintended directions. Your eyes are stinging. That's normal. Everyone's eyes are stinging, re-drimmed, watering slightly from the constant irritation. You blink more in coffee houses than anywhere else. Your body's futile attempt to clear away irritants that are literally everywhere in the air. You're breathing. The smoke doesn't just affect your eyes. Either it coats your throat, makes you cough occasionally, creates that particular coffeehouse voice that's slightly raspy from constant irritation. The smell of tobacco has layers. There's the sweet, aromatic scent of good Virginia leaf, the harsh, almost burnt odor of cheaper blends, the distinctive mustiness of old tobacco ash, and underlying it all, the chemical tang of burning plant matter mixing with coffee fumes and human sweat to create a bouquet that's uniquely coffeehouse. Some men are clearly addicted. You can tell by the way they pack and light their pipes with automatic efficiency, by how their hands fidget when pipes go out, by the irritability that emerges when tobacco supplies run low. Tobacco addiction isn't officially recognized as a medical condition yet, but watch these men go without their pipes for an hour and you'll recognize the symptoms easily enough. The coffee boy is distributing fresh tapers again, his small face barely visible through the smoke. He doesn't cough anymore when he walks through the worst cloud she's adapted. his young lungs apparently accepting that this is just what air is like now. You're not sure whether that's resilience or tragedy. Your own throat feels coated, scratchy, like you've been smoking yourself despite not touching a pipe. Secondhand smoke isn't a concept anyone's articulated yet, but the physical reality is undeniable. You're inhaling whatever everyone else is exhaling, participating in collective tobacco consumption whether you chose to or not. The pipes keep breaking. The smoke keeps rising. The conversations continue through the haze, men arguing about philosophy while slowly asphyxiating themselves in the name of social custom. And you just keep breathing it in, because leaving means missing the conversation, and missing the conversation means wasting your penny admission. Welcome to the coffee house. Your lungs will never forgive you. Here's the thing that's becoming increasingly clear as you sit in this smoke-filled room drinking terrible coffee. You're not just witnessing social gathering. You're watching the infrastructure of modern capitalism being assembled in real time, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, all fueled by a bitter beverage and maintained by collective agreement that this chaos somehow works. Think about what's happening around you right now. At that table, insurance is being invented. Over there, stock trading is evolving from informal agreements into systematic markets. In the corner, journalism is taking shape as newspapers and pamphlets circulate and editors solicit submissions. Near the fireplace, scientific knowledge is being shared and debated, advancing understanding through collaborative discourse. And everywhere, constantly, information is flowing: market intelligence, political news, technical knowledge, social connections, all of it moving through the Coffeehouse network at unprecedented speed. The economic impact alone is staggering. Before coffeehouses, if you wanted to conduct business with someone, you needed to know where to find them, their home, their office, their place of work. Information moved slowly through messengers and formal appointments with all the inefficiency that implied. But now you just show up at the right coffeehouse at the right time and the people you need to see will be there. It's a self-organizing system, remarkably efficient, requiring no central coordination beyond collective understanding of which establishment serves which purpose. Lloyd's Coffeehouse has essentially become the London Shipping Exchange. If you need information about vessels, cargo, routes, or insurance, you go there. The proprietor maintains lists of ship arrivals and departures, tracks which vessels are overdue, collects intelligence from captains about conditions in foreign ports. This information used to be scattered across dozens of merchants' private records. Now it's centralized, accessible, shared freely among the coffeehouse community. The efficiency gains are enormous. Jonathan's Coffeehouse serves the same function for stock trading. Instead of individual brokers operating from separate offices, they all congregate in one space where they can see each other, hear competing offers, adjust prices in real time based on market conditions. It's messy and chaotic and probably encourages all kinds of manipulation, but it's also faster and more transparent than any previous system for trading shares. The newspapers you've been watching circulate? Those exist because coffeehouses provide guaranteed distribution networks. Publishers know that every major coffeehouse will buy multiple copies, that readers will share them, that news will spread through the coffeehouse network to reach thousands of people within hours. Before coffeehouses, news traveled slowly through personal correspondence and official announcements. Now it moves at the speed of coffee boys delivering fresh printed papers to established routes. Historians still argue whether coffeehouses created these innovations or simply provided convenient venues for changes that would have happened anyway. But try imagining modern insurance or stock markets developing without some kind of physical gathering place where people could meet, exchange information, and build trust through repeated interaction. The intellectual impact is equally profound, though harder to quantify. The Penny University isn't just clever marketing, it's genuinely transforming how knowledge circulates in English society. Traditionally, education was restricted to those who could afford private tutors or university enrollment. Books were expensive, Libraries were private, and knowledge was hoarded by elites who used it to maintain social advantage. But in coffeehouses, knowledge flows promiscuously. The merchant explaining compound interest isn't charging tuition. The sea captain describing foreign lands isn't requiring credentials before sharing his observations. The natural philosopher debating scientific theories isn't limiting his audience to registered students. Information wants to be free, apparently, or at least available for the price of coffee. This democratization of knowledge has real consequences. Men who would never attend university are learning mathematics, science, philosophy, foreign languages. They're developing critical thinking skills through exposure to debate and argument. They're forming networks across professional and class boundaries that give them access to opportunities that would otherwise remain invisible. Social mobility isn't exactly easy in 1742, but coffeehouses are creating paths that didn't previously exist. The impact on journalism and publishing is revolutionary. Writers have venues where they can test material, receive immediate feedback, and connect with potential publishers or patrons. The literary culture that's developing at Wills and Buttons is producing some of the era's most important writing jays, satires, novels, poems all, workshopped in coffeehouse conversations before appearing in print. Political discourse is being fundamentally reshaped too. Before coffeehouses, political discussion was limited to parliament, aristocratic salons, and private correspondence. Common people knew what their leaders decided but had little understanding of why decisions were made or what alternatives existed. Coffeehouses changed that equation. Political news circulates immediately. Decisions are analyzed from multiple angles. Alternative policies are proposed and debated. The people drinking coffee are developing political consciousness, understanding governmental operations, forming opinions based on information rather than just accepting authority. Is this dangerous to the established order? Absolutely. That's why the government keeps trying to control coffeehouses without quite succeeding. The cat's out of the bag. You can't put this level of information exchange back into the restricted channels it used to flow through. The commercial networks being built here are also reshaping trade patterns. Merchants make connections that lead to new partnerships. Investors find opportunities they wouldn't otherwise hear about. Information about market conditions in foreign ports allows traders to adjust strategies, avoiding gluts and shortages. The man next to you just learned that sugar prices are likely to rise because of drought in Jamaican formation that might be worth hundreds of pounds if he acts on it quickly. Even the physical structure of commerce is changing. Coffee houses are becoming de facto offices for professions that don't require permanent premises. Lawyers meet clients here. Insurance underwriters conduct business here. Shipbrokers negotiate contracts here. The overhead is minimal, just the price of coffee, while the networking opportunities are maximal. Why pay for chambers when you can work from a coffeehouse booth? You're sitting in the middle of an economic and intellectual revolution, watching it happen one cup of terrible coffee at a time. The modern world is being born in rooms like this by people like these, fueled by caffeine and tobacco and the remarkable human drive to connect, share, argue and build. And somehow, improbably, it's actually working. The chaos has patterns. The noise contains signal. The smoke-filled confusion is producing genuine innovation. You reach for your coffee cup, now cold and somehow more unpleasant than when it was hot. But the conversations around you continue. The business deals keep closing. The ideas keep flowing. The coffeehouse isn't just serving beverages sites rewiring civilization. So you've been sitting here for hours absorbing the chaos, and you're probably feeling reasonably comfortable by now. But here's what you don't realize. You've been violating unspoken social rules left and right, and the only reason you haven't been publicly shamed is that everyone recognizes you as a newcomer and is cutting you some slack. Barely. Let's start with the newspapers, because apparently you've been handling them wrong this entire time. When a newspaper finishes circulating through one group and becomes available, you don't just grab it. That would be barbaric. You wait. You make eye contact with whoever's currently reading to confirm they're actually finished. You check whether anyone else has prior claim based on having been waiting longer. Only then do you reach for it, and even then you handle it carefully because that paper needs to survive dozens of readers before the day is done. Reading time is also regulated by invisible convention. You get maybe 10 or 15 minutes with a popular newspaper before social pressure mounts for you to pass it along. Some selfish bastards will try to monopolize papers for an hour, reading every advertisement and notice, but watch the disapproving looks they receive. The community enforces sharing through collective judgment, and nobody wants to be known as the paper-hogging fool. When you finish with a newspaper, you don't just drop it on the table like trash. You fold it reasonably neatly and place it where the next person can easily access it. Crumpling newspapers, tearing pages, or God forbid taking them with you when you leave is grounds for serious social censure. These papers are communal property, and disrespecting them is disrespecting the entire coffeehouse community. Seating has its own complex etiquette. You don't take a seat that's clearly being held for someone indicated by a hat, a pipe, or simply an arrangement of possessions that screams occupied. You don't squeeze into a full booth when there's available space elsewhere, even if the conversation at that booth sounds more interesting. And you absolutely never, ever claim one of the prime spots near the fireplace unless you're a recognized regular or someone with sufficient social standing that nobody will challenge you. If you need to join a crowded bench, you ask, not in words necessarily, a raised eyebrow and a gesture might suffice, but you seek permission rather than just inserting yourself into someone else's space. The response is usually a grudging shift, creating minimal room, but it's offered freely because everyone understands that coffeehouse democracy requires accepting some discomfort. Joining conversations requires reading the room with considerable skill. Some discussions are clearly open. Anyone can contribute, add observations, challenge arguments. Others are private business negotiations, identifiable by lowered voices and closed body language. Barging into the latter with your opinions about maritime insurance will mark you as socially incompetent at best, deliberately rude at worst. Here's the subtle part. Even in open conversations, there's a hierarchy of speaking rights. Regulars get more leeway to dominate discussion. Experts on relevant topics command attention. Newcomers need to earn their place through demonstrating wit, knowledge, or at minimum the good sense to listen before pontificating. You can't just show up and start lecturing about subjects you barely understand. Well, you can, but you'll be ignored or mocked depending on how egregious your overreach. Disagreement is encouraged, but there are limits. You can argue vehemently about politics, philosophy, scientific theories, business practices. Argumentation is practically the coffeehouse's defining feature. But personal insults cross a line. Questioning someone's honor, insulting their family, making it personal rather than intellectual. That's how arguments escalate into duels or brawls, and the proprietor will intervene to shut down both parties before that happens. There's also the matter of toasting. When someone proposes a toast to the king, to a friend's health, to commercial success, you raise your cup whether you agree or not. Refusing is taken as deliberate insult unless you have excellent reasons and the social capital to get away with it. The merchant next to you just toasted to honest dealing and fair profit, and everyone raised their coffee cups reflexively, even though half the people here are probably engaged in somewhat dishonest dealing for unfair profit. Historians still argue whether these unspoken rules genuinely created social cohesion or simply papered over fundamental conflicts through forced conformity, but either way, violating them carries real social cost. Payment etiquette is straightforward but absolute. You pay for your coffee. Every cup, every time, no exceptions. Trying to leave without paying is theft, pure and simple, and the coffee boys are remarkably good at spotting potential runners. If you genuinely can't pay, you don't order. Some coffee houses extend credit to trusted regulars, but that's a privilege earned over time, not an assumption. Treatment of staff is another area with firm expectations. The coffee boys are beneath your notice socially, but you don't actively mistreat them. You don't grab cups from their trays without letting them set them down properly. You don't blame them for the coffee's terrible quality. That's not their fault. You don't prevent them from doing their jobs by blocking their paths or refusing to move when they need to serve someone near you. Some topics are handled with discretion, even in coffeehouses' relatively open atmosphere. Detailed discussion of sexual matters happens, but with awareness that some present might find it offensive. Religious debate is acceptable, but treads carefully around outright blasphemy. Business dealings that are clearly illegal get discussed in code or corners, not shouted across the room. Not shouted across the room. There's also the question of bodily functions. Spitting on the floor, including tobacco juice, is unfortunately acceptable, though aiming for the sawdust rather than clean boards is preferred. Relieving yourself means using those chamber pots behind the curtain, not just wandering outside to use the alley. Excessive belching or other sounds draw disapproving looks, even in this casual environment. Standards exist, they're just lower than in other social contexts. Time limits are enforced through social pressure rather than explicit rules. You can nurse 1 cup of coffee for an hour during slow periods, but during busy times, you're expected to either order more or yield your seat to waiting customers. The coffee house can't function if people claim spaces indefinitely while spending minimally. Watch the older regular near the fireplace. He knows every rule instinctively, navigates social situations with effortless grace, commands respect through understanding the system. That's what you're aspiring to fluency in coffeehouse culture. The ability to participate without constantly second-guessing whether you're committing some subtle violation. You're learning. You've only awkwardly grabbed 2 newspapers today, squeezed into one conversation you should have stayed out of, and possibly insulted that gentleman by not toasting enthusiastically enough. Tomorrow you'll do better. Probably, here's something nobody's told you yet. Something that would surprise the enthusiastic patrons arguing around you. This golden age you're experiencing? It's already fading. The coffeehouse as democratic institution, as radical social experiment, as centre of English intellectual and commercial life it's peaked, and the decline has already begun, even if nobody in this room realises it yet. The signs are subtle but unmistakable if you know what to look for. That gentleman by the fireplace who mentioned having a meeting, at the club tomorrow he's talking about something new, something that's quietly replacing coffeehouses for men of his class. Private clubs are emerging across London, offering everything coffeehouses provide, but with one crucial addition: exclusivity. These clubs, Whites, Boodles, Brookses and others forming every year require membership, charge substantial fees, maintain standards of admission based on wealth and social standing. They're coffee houses, minus the democracy, spaces where gentlemen can gather without having to share benches with merchants' clerks or tolerate poets without patronage. The exclusivity is the point. The whole messy mixing of classes that makes coffee houses so revolutionary. The upper classes are increasingly deciding they don't actually want that. The clubs offer superior facilities too. Better furniture, cleaner spaces, actual privacy when you need it, food that won't give you dysentery. Compare this sticky, smoke-filled chaos to the refined comfort of a gentleman's club, and the appeal becomes obvious if you can afford admission and meet the social requirements. And here's the thing, as the wealthy withdraw into private clubs, coffee houses lose their most influential patrons. The Duke's nephew who was slumming it this afternoon? In 5 years he'll conduct all his business at his club, surrounded by people of similar background. The coffee house won't get his money, his connections, or his participation in its democratic experiment. Tea is the other killer, though it's happening slowly enough that most people haven't noticed the shift. Remember those merchants drinking tea earlier? They're the advance guard of a trend that will eventually dominate English beverage culture. Tea is simply more pleasant to drink than this terrible coffee. It's not grainy, it can actually taste good with milk and sugar, and it doesn't leave residue between your teeth. The East India Company is aggressively marketing tea, understanding that capturing English taste preferences means guaranteed profits for centuries. They're succeeding. Tea gardens are opening outdoor spaces where families can gather, where women can attend without scandal, where the experience is designed to be pleasant rather than challenging. Who wants to sit in a smoky coffee house when you can drink tea in a garden with your wife and daughters? Historians still argue whether the rise of tea and decline of coffee reflected genuine taste preferences or successful marketing by commercial interests. But the result is the same. Coffee consumption is starting to level off while tea consumption grows exponentially. The intellectual culture is fragmenting too. The penny university concept works when knowledgeable people across disciplines all gather in the same spaces. But increasingly, specialized societies are forming the Royal Society for Science, various literary societies for writers, professional associations for specific trades. These groups meet in private spaces, charge membership fees, maintain standards of expertise. They're more efficient at knowledge exchange than random coffeehouse conversations, but they lose the cross-pollination that made those conversations so valuable. Political discourse is becoming more dangerous, not less. The government's tolerance for seditious coffeehouse talk is wearing thin. More informers are being employed. More publishers of inflammatory pamphlets are being prosecuted. The freewheeling political debates you've been witnessing, they're increasingly risky, and some of the bolder participants are learning to moderate their language or conduct such discussions in more private settings. The commercialization is changing coffeehouse culture too. What started as relatively simple, establishment coffee, benches, conversationa, becoming more elaborate, offering more services, charging more money. Some are practically becoming restaurants with coffeehouse branding. The simplicity that made them accessible to everyone is being lost to competition for upscale clientele. Even the physical landscape is shifting. London is growing, spreading outward, and coffeehouse culture doesn't transplant easily to residential neighborhoods. The clustering around commercial centers that created such vibrant networks, it doesn't work the same way when coffeehouses are scattered across expanding suburbs serving local communities rather than drawing from across the city. The newspapers and pamphlets that fueled coffeehouse discourse are also changing. Commercial advertising is taking up more space, reducing room for political content. Publishers are increasingly cautious about what they print, wary of prosecution. The bold, seditious publications that circulated so freely are becoming rarer, replaced by safer, blander content. Look around this room. The energy is still here, the conversation's still flowing, the business still being conducted. Everything seems fine, vibrant even. But you're watching the twilight of something, the last full expression of an idea before it transforms into something else's, something more controlled, more segregated, more respectable, and considerably less revolutionary. The coffeehouse won't disappear entirely. These establishments will persist for decades, even centuries in some form. But the democratic ideal, the radical mixing of classes, the open exchange of dangerous ideas that's already being contained, redirected into safer channels, domesticated by forces that found the original version too threatening or simply too chaotic to sustain. Your merchant neighbor mentioned earlier that he prefers the serious morning crowd to the evening chaos. That preference, that desire for order, predictability, social sorting, that's the future. Coffee houses will increasingly cater to specific clienteles, develop distinct characters, become less about mixing and more about providing appropriate spaces for particular groups. The insurance market developing at Lloyd's will eventually leave the coffee house entirely, forming a formal exchange with rules and regulations. The stock trading at Jonathan's will moved to the actual stock exchange. The literary culture will shift to salons and societies. The scientific discussions will happen at the Royal Society. All the functions coffee houses currently serve will be taken over by more specialized, more exclusive, more efficient institutions. What will remain? Social gathering places certainly. Somewhere to drink coffee and read newspapers. But the magic of this moment, when a penny bought you entry to democracy, education and revolution all at once, that's fading like smoke in the air. The man at the next table is planning his next business venture, completely unaware he's participating in a dying experiment. The poets in the corner are arguing about meter, not realizing their kind will soon retreat to private literary clubs. The political radicals are plotting revolution that will never quite materialize. You're sitting in the twilight, watching the sun set on an era that never quite lived up to its radical promise, but still managed to shake the foundations of English society. The coffee tastes the same as it did ours, a gow, which is to say, terrible. But somehow, knowing this might be one of the last generations to experience coffee houses in their pure, chaotic, democratic form makes even the terrible coffee taste bittersweet. Your coffee has gone completely cold now, a film forming on its surface that looks vaguely biological. You've been here for what? 5 hours? 6? Time moves strangely in coffee houses, measured not by clocks but by conversations, by the number of cups consumed, by how many times the crowd has cycled through its daily transformations. The evening rush is in full swing around you. The voices are louder now, more boisterous, as workers finish their day and arrive seeking relaxation, gossip, and the companionship of strangers who've become familiar through repeated proximity. The smoke is thicker too, if that's even possible, the tobacco clouds creating a fog so dense you can barely make out the faces near the fireplace. You should probably leave. Your wife is expecting you home for supper. Your clothes smell like you've been living inside a chimney. Your throat is raw from breathing smoke, your eyes are stinging, and you're fairly certain that terrible coffee has permanently damaged your digestive system. But something keeps you in your seat, reluctant to break the spell, to step back into the ordinary world outside these stained walls. Look around one more time. Really look. The merchant to your left is concluding a deal that will send cargo across the Atlantic, creating wealth or ruin depending on weather and luck. The poets in the corner are workshopping verses that might outlive everyone in this room. The political radicals are discussing ideas that could reshape government if anyone important were listening. The chess players are locked in silent combat that mirrors larger strategic thinking. And everywhere, constantly, information is flowing: news, gossip, knowledge, opinions circulating through the Coffeehouse network to reach thousands of people before the night is done. This remarkable, grimy, democratic, chaotic institution has given you something you didn't have this morning, a glimpse of a different way of organizing society. Not perfectly, equal women are excluded, the poor can barely afford the penny admission, and subtle hierarchies persist despite egalitarian pretensions. But still, something genuinely novel is happening here. Dukes are sharing benches with dockworkers. Knowledge is flowing across class boundaries. Ideas are being tested in public rather than confined to elite circles. The mainstream historical record will note that coffeehouses peaked in influence during the early to mid-18th century before being supplanted by private clubs and tea culture. That's the official version. What they won't fully capture is the feeling of being here, of participating in this messy experiment, of watching civilization evolve over cups of terrible coffee in smoke-filled ruins where the floor sticks to your boots. Here's a quirky tidbit that historians love. Some coffee houses employed runners who would fetch patrons from nearby taverns or homes when important visitors arrived, essentially operating as human paging systems decades before telephones existed. The social networks were so strong that people knew where to find each other based on time of day, regular habits, and coffeehouse affiliation. Historians still argue whether coffeehouses genuinely transformed English society or merely reflected changes that would have occurred anyway through other mechanisms. But sitting here in the thick of it, causation feels less important than experience. Something is happening, something significant, and you're part of it simply by being present. Your grey-whiskered companion left hours ago, but new faces have filled the space around you. A young clerk discussing his master's unfair treatment. A sea captain describing storms off the African coast. A pamphleteer trying to interest anyone who'll listen in his latest political screed. They're all here, all participating, all contributing to the great cacophonous conversation that defines coffeehouse culture. The proprietor is making his rounds, assessing the room with practiced eyes, calculating how much longer he can keep serving before exhaustion overtakes profit motive. The coffee boys are moving slower now, tired from hours of constant motion, their efficiency degraded by fatigue, but still functional. That copper pot in the back is running low, probably the last batch before closing. You reach into your pocket and find a few remaining coins. Enough for one more cup, maybe two if you're conservative. The question is whether you want to extend this experience or whether you've absorbed all the coffeehouse has to offer for one day. The coffee will taste exactly as terrible as your previous cups. The smoke isn't getting any thinner. The conversations will continue their circular patterns of argument and agreement, disagreement and synthesis. But leaving means stepping back into a world where people don't randomly explain navigation techniques or debate political philosophy or conduct business deals in public. Outside these walls, society reasserts its normal hierarchies. The Duke's nephew returns to his estate. The dockworker returns to his tenement. The carefully maintained fiction of equality dissolves like sugar in hot coffee. One more cup then, one final participation in the ritual. You raise your hand, catching the coffee boy's eye, and he nods acknowledgement. The last cup of the night, payment for admission to something that won't last forever but exists, powerfully, right now. The evening crowd roars on around you. The tobacco smoke swirls in lazy patterns. The newspapers continue their endless circulation, and you sit here, wedged between strangers who feel almost like friends, drinking terrible coffee in the twilight of an era. The 18th century is drawing to a close, though you won't live to see its end. The coffeehouse culture you're experiencing is already transforming into something else, something more controlled and less wild. But tonight, in this moment, the democratic experiment is still alive, still functioning, still offering its peculiar magic to anyone with a penny and the tolerance for discomfort. Your final cup arrives, steaming and grainy and exactly as unpleasant as expected. You raise it in silent toast to this remarkable institution, to the people who created it, to the brief moment when coffee and conversation almost changed the world. Then you drink, grounds and all, because that's what you do in a coffee house. The noise around you is beginning to soften now, or perhaps you're simply growing accustomed to its rhythms. The way the ocean's roar eventually becomes silence to those who live beside it. The voices blend together into something almost musical, a low hum of human connection that requires nothing from you except presence. You can just sit here, letting the conversations wash over you without trying to follow their threads, without needing to contribute or even understand. The candlelight seems gentler than it did hours ago, the flames steadier, casting softer shadows that no longer dance frantically but sway with drowsy contentment. Even the tobacco smoke appears less aggressive now, hanging peacefully in the air like morning mist over a quiet river, filtering the light into something amber and warm and deeply, impossibly old. The weight of the day is settling into your bones not unpleasantly, but with the satisfaction of time well spent, of having been somewhere that mattered, even if just for a moment. Your breathing has synchronized with the room's rhythm, slow and steady, each inhalation bringing the familiar sense of coffee and tobacco and human gathering, each exhalation releasing the tensions and worries that seemed so important this morning. The people around you are becoming indistinct now, their features blurring into friendly shadows, their words transforming into a gentle lullaby of commerce and philosophy and gossip that no longer demands your attention. They'll continue their conversations long after you've gone, these coffeehouse patrons, carrying on the ancient human tradition of gathering together to share warmth and words and terrible beverages. Your empty cup sits before you, cool porcelain that has served its purpose, a small vessel that briefly connected you to something larger, to trade networks spanning oceans, to ideas crossing centuries, to the simple human need for community and caffeine and spaces where strangers become, however temporarily, something approaching friends. The coffee house will still be here tomorrow, its doors open to anyone with a penny and the willingness to accept discomfort in exchange for belonging. But you don't need to think about tomorrow. Tonight has been enough more than enough. Tonight you stepped into history, drank terrible coffee, breathed impossible amounts of smoke, and participated, however briefly, in a small revolution. The evening continues its gentle progression toward night. The fireplace glows with embers now rather than flames. The last newspapers have been folded and set aside. And you, comfortable in your corner, surrounded by the quiet chaos of coffeehouse life, can finally let yourself drift, knowing you've witnessed something remarkable, something that won't last forever but existed, beautifully and imperfectly, here in this smoke-stained room where democracy cost exactly 1 penny and tasted like burnt dirt mixed with possibility. Sleep well, traveller. The 18th century coffeehouse has one last gift for you, permission to rest, to close your eyes, to let the voices fade into peaceful silence while history continues its patient work of transforming moments into memory and memory into dreams.